CSSG. In fact, as of May 8th, my expectation was still that a supercharged version of the Canada Service Corps would likely deliver the program. From my perspective, We Charity hadn't come up. Service had already concluded that We Charity was the best option to deliver this program. They had formally recommended it. The CSSG, including the recommendation that We Charity be used, had already gone through the COVID Committee of Cabinet on May 5th. I was not involved in either of those steps. On May 8th, I received a briefing before the Cabinet meeting and learned for the first time that We Charity had been recommended as a partner and was on the Cabinet agenda. I asked why the plan didn't involve the Canada Service Corps. We were told that the Canada Service Corps wouldn't be able to scale up to deliver the program in time. This was disappointing, but ultimately not surprising to me, given my understanding of the state of the Canada Service Corps' development and other demands facing the public service at the time. Of course, policy staff in my office had been working with the Privy Council office and other departments. They knew that We Charity was under consideration. However, I never spoke with my staff about We Charity or its proposed involvement in administering this program until May 8th. I also never spoke to Craig or Mark Kielberger or anyone at We Charity about the CSSG. I did not speak to either of them at all during this period. As it became apparent to me, my Chief of Staff, Katie Telford, also didn't know until the briefing on May 8th that We Charity was being proposed. So my Chief of Staff and I were finding out about this important part of the proposal only hours before the Cabinet meeting. Even given the rapid pace of work during the crisis, this was not the way things were supposed to go. We learned that there had been tough questions asked about the CSSG proposal and We Charity during the COVID committee a few days earlier. We both felt that we needed more time before this item was presented to Cabinet, time to consider and understand the reasons behind the proposal that We Charity deliver the program. On that issue, we had several questions that we wanted answered, particularly given my specific expertise in youth issues. During the pandemic, government was working very hard and very quickly. We still are. It was not uncommon for me to be briefed on something relatively close in time to the Cabinet meeting. Here, however, given the scale of the program, the questions that have been raised, and my own commitment to youth issues, we needed more time. As well, we both knew that We Charity was known to be connected to people in our government, including myself, as I'd spoken at their events in the past. So we knew that the selection of We Charity would be closely scrutinized. We wanted to make sure that the process and decision were the best possible in the circumstances. So I decided to pull the CSSG proposal from the Cabinet agenda for May 8th so that further work could be done. This wasn't an easy decision. We knew the urgency. By the end of April, many university students had finished their exams. We were already a week into May, but we pulled the item from the agenda so that we could be confident that we were doing the right thing the right way. My primary concern was to make sure that the public service could fully support its recommendation that without a doubt, We Charity was the right and indeed the only partner to deliver the program. I was briefed again on May 21st, and the public service told me that they had done the due diligence we'd asked for and that they were confident in the recommendation. In effect, they said that if we wanted this program to happen, it could only be with We Charity. The choice was not between providers. It was between going ahead with We Charity to deliver the program or not going ahead with the program at all. Given the public service advice, I was comfortable that the CSSG could now be presented to Cabinet. On May 22nd, Minister Chagger presented the program to Cabinet, and Cabinet approved it. After Cabinet approved the CSSG, the next step was to approve its funding. Here, the briefing note from policy staff in my office recommended imposing an additional oversight measure in the dispersal of the approved funding. I agreed with that recommendation and directed that before additional tranches of funding were released, Minister Chagger would have to write to the President of the Treasury Board to provide an update on the CSSG. When Cabinet approved the CSSG, obviously I knew that I had spoken at various We Charity events. I'd never been paid to do so. I was also aware that my wife had an unpaid role as a We Charity ambassador and ally. I knew she appeared at We Charity events and that when she traveled to get to an event, We Charity covered her related expenses. I also knew that Sophie had recently launched a podcast on mental wellness in conjunction with We Charity. The Ethics Commissioner had approved this role, including We Charity covering her expenses. I also knew that my brother and mother had worked with We Charity as well as with other organizations. However, I did not know how much work either of them had done with We Charity or how much they'd been paid. These were things that I would only learn after the program launched publicly. That said, sometimes recusing oneself can be the right thing to do, even if it's not required. Here, my mother's connection to We Charity and the other connections in my family could lead some people to wonder whether those connections had played some role in the decision to select We Charity. That, of course, was not the case. We Charity received no preferential treatment, not from me, not from anyone else. The public service recommended We Charity, and I did absolutely nothing to influence that recommendation. I didn't even know it had been made until May 8th. And when I learned that We Charity was recommended, I pushed back. I wanted to be satisfied that the proposal that We Charity deliver the CSSG had been properly scrutinized. L'organisme uni n'a pas reçu de traitement de faveur, ni de moi, ni de qui que ce soit d'autre. La fonction publique a recommandé l'organisme uni et je n'ai absolument rien fait pour influencer cette recommandation. Je ne savais même pas que la recommandation avait été faite avant le 8 mai. Lorsque j'ai appris qu'on nous recommandait Uni, j'avais des questions. Je voulais être certain que la proposition de faire appel à Uni pour mettre en œuvre le programme avait été examinée de près. Comme je l'ai dit, j'aurais dû me retirer de cette décision pour éviter toute apparence de favoritisme. Je sais que les apparences peuvent nuire à un bon programme. Et bien sûr, c'est exactement ce qui est arrivé ici et c'est vraiment dommage, surtout parce que c'est un programme qui aurait pu être très important pour les étudiants et pour nos communautés. Pour conclure, ni moi, ni mon personnel avons tenté de dicter ou d'influencer la recommandation émise par la fonction publique concernant l'organisme uni. To conclude, there was never any direction by or attempt to influence from me or my staff that the public service recommend We Charity. Getting young people to serve has been a goal of mine well before I ever got into politics. So I deeply regret how this has unfolded. It's now July 30th. Our government is delivering an up to $9 billion aid package for students. Unfortunately, the grant for volunteer service is unlikely to be part of the package this summer, and that is something that I regret. I'm pleased now to take any of your questions.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Before we go to questions, just for Mr. Morantz's point and also for relevance, I would remind the committee of the original motion. As part of its study on COVID-19, we hold hearings to examine how much the government spent in awarding the $912 million sole source contract to We Charity, and how the outsourcing of the Canada Student Service Grant to We Charity proceeded as far as it did. On Mr. Morantz's point, and I think you are aware of this, Mr. Prime Minister, with the way questions work in the House of Commons, I call it the COVID-19 questioning experience, where each member is allocated so much time, and we will stick to the 6 minutes for the first round and 5 for the second today for questions and answers. But the process will be if it's an 8-second question, we expect the answer to be 8 seconds, and I will try and track that on my iPad here. I may be a little off from time to time. So if we can, from both sides, so there will be no doubt interruptions on the part of the chair to the witness, yourself, Prime Minister, and probably to members as well, to stick to those rules. The first round of questions will be Mr. Poilievre, followed by a splitting of time between Mr. Fragiskatis and Ms. Kotrakis, and then Mr. Fortin and Mr. Angus. Mr. Poilievre, 6 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Prime Minister. What is the total dollar value of all of the expenses reimbursed, fees paid to, and any other consideration provided by the We Group to you, your mother, your spouse, your brother, and any other member of your family? Just the total, please.
Minister.
Sorry, mute. I don't have that exact figure. Reimbursing expenses is something done by an organization, for example. So I don't have those totals.
Mr. Speaker, point of order.
Yeah, what's your
Mr.
point
Chair,
of order?
sorry, no, Mr. Speaker. My point of order is, what's the relevance of these questions of ancillary fees paid to family members to the official motion that you
I don't think that is a point of order, Ms. Zerwitz. Back to Mr. Poilievre.
So you're telling me that you don't know how much immediate family members have been paid in expense reimbursements by this organization?
My mother and my brother are professionals in their own right who have engagements and have for many, many years with many different organizations across the country. And I don't have the details of their work experiences or their expenses.
And what about your spouse? What is the dollar figure?
I think We Charity has been able to share those dollar figures with you.
When was the last time she had an expense reimbursed by We Charity?
I believe it would have been for the trip to London where she spoke at We, but those expenses were cleared in advance by the Ethics Commission.
And how much was it?
Mr. Poilievre.
How much were those expenses?
I don't have that number in front of me.
Mr. Prime Minister, it's very hard to believe you don't have that number. You've been embroiled in this scandal now for over a month, and these kinds of questions have been asked repeatedly. I asked it to you in the House of Commons weeks ago. You've had time to get it, so I'll ask again. How much was your spouse reimbursed by We for her recent trip to London?
Okay, to take an example, for a plane ticket that was booked for her flight to London, it wasn't something that she would have paid for to be reimbursed by
what about a hotel?
Charity. The We Charity would have actually paid for that ticket themselves. So we wouldn't have those answers on our credit cards, for example.
So you don't have any idea how much the We Charity paid for your spouse to travel to London?
Over the past number of months, I've been involved in serving Canadians and focused on that. But I know that the We Charity themselves have shared those expenses, and
they have not.
The opportunity to talk to them.
They have not shared those expenses, Prime Minister. They have refused to tell us the itemized expense for that trip, and they didn't even confirm she was on that trip. What hotel did they pay for her to stay at?
I don't know.
Okay. This would have been a very expensive trip, and it would have been paid for in March. Your government then, a month later, was amassing a program of $500 million, which you now admit you helped approve a month after that. How could you possibly have believed that it was appropriate for you to approve a nearly $500 million grant to a group that only 60 days earlier was paying for sumptuous travels for immediate members of your family?
The
Mr. Prime Minister.
The Ethics Commissioner fully cleared Sophie's volunteer unpaid work with We, whether it's for her podcast or her appearance at We events or her work as a We ambassador and ally. It was all entirely unpaid, but they reimbursed expenses, and that was clearance that was gotten in advance by the Ethics Commissioner.
And did you tell the Ethics
Commissioner? Mr. Poilievre, we're on equal time here, and the Prime Minister still has time. Go ahead, Prime Minister.
Obviously, that was not a concern for me, knowing that the Ethics Commissioner had approved of Sophie volunteering her time and having expenses covered for engagements with this.
And when you became became involved with the decision to approve the $500 million grant to We Charity on May the 5th, did you then immediately inform the ethics commissioner that you were doing that, and and also inform the ethics commissioner that this group was paying expenses for your spouse?
As I said, the ethics commissioner already knew because he had approved Sophie volunteering with the We organization a long time ago. And secondly, my knowledge of We being involved in delivering this program only happened on May 8th, not on May 5th, as you are saying.
On May 8th, did you contact the ethics commissioner to seek permission to be part of the decision to approve this $500 million grant? Yes or no?
On May 8th, I received the formal recommendation by the public service that they go ahead with the We program, that they go ahead with the We program to deliver it. And I pulled it back from cabinet and asked them to do further due diligence because I knew there would be questions.
I'm sorry, Prime Minister, back to Mr. Poilievre.
Time remaining?
You have about 68 seconds.
Mr. Prime Minister, you admit now that you should have removed yourself from the decision to grant this $500 million grant to the We Charity. You were found guilty of taking a free vacation from someone who sought a $15 million grant from you. Strike one. You were found guilty of interfering with the criminal prosecution of a Liberal Link corporation. Strike
Chair,
two.
Point of order.
What's your point of order, Mr. Sabera?
The MP Poilievre has brought up some points that are not of relevance to this committee and the motion put forth.
I am going to allow the question, but Mr. Poilievre, please leave time for the answer in your 6 minutes as well. Go ahead.
Thank you. You were twice found guilty of breaking the Ethics Act before, strikes 1 and 2, and now you admit a third strike by your failure to recuse yourself, and in the process you broke the Ethics Act a third time. What happens in baseball when you have 3 strikes?
That's the end of the your round, Mr. Poilievre. Mr. Prime Minister, you have about 30 seconds to respond.
As I said to Canadians a number of weeks ago, I should have recused myself, knowing the connections between my family and the perceptions around this issue. However, I did not intervene to make this recommendation happen. When the recommendation came forward from the public service, I sent it back to the public service to say, you really need to make sure that this is indeed the only organization that can deliver this program, and that this is done exactly the right way, because there is going to be careful scrutiny on this. At that point, instead, I should have recused myself, but I didn't. I decided to push back instead, and that I regret, because young people aren't having the opportunities they would have had this summer through that program, even though there's many other things we're doing for young people this summer.
Thank you, Prime Minister. We'll turn to Mr. Fragiskatis for 4 minutes and Ms. Kotrakis for 2 on a split round. Mr. Fragiskatis.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Prime Minister, for being here. First of all, Mr. Prime Minister, is there a personal relationship between you and the Kielburgers? Are you friends? Have you spent social time together? Have you had dinners together or anything like that?
No, I have seen them at events, but not outside of official or public events.
Thank you very much. I do want to ask you, Prime Minister, about the lack of recusal. Some have suggested that perhaps the recusal did not happen because the pandemic is forcing decisions to be made quicker than ever before. And when decisions are made quickly, mistakes are more likely to happen. First of all, to what extent is that a fair observation in your view? And second, if it is a fair observation, COVID-19 will certainly set the context within which policy is made for some time to come. That implies that choices about policy and programs will need to continue to be made very quickly. Are there mechanisms in place at the cabinet level or in other institutions of decision making? Are they in place to prevent a mistake of this kind from happening again?
First of all, thank you for the question. Obviously, Yes, during a time of pandemic, things are accelerated. And as I said from the beginning, and as I've said throughout this pandemic and all my press conferences, we've moved quickly to try and get help out to people as fast as we could, as flexibly as we could, and we would fix those mistakes as we went on. So there was an understanding that if we waited until everything was perfect before doing anything, far too many Canadians would suffer, and because of the health emergency, even die. So we needed to act quickly. And that is certainly part of the context, but I don't think it's the whole reason as to why I didn't recuse myself. Youth issues have been something that I've been deeply involved with all my career. And I care deeply about the idea of youth service and seeing young people be able to help in their communities with organizations across the country. So this proposal mattered to me. And I, instead of encouraging it along, like some people say, because it was somehow connected to my family, I actually slowed it down and pushed back on it to try and make sure that everything was done exactly right, because I knew there would be questions asked because of the links to the family. But in no way was this benefiting my mother or my brother to be creating a grant program for students to volunteer in their communities right across the country.
Mr. Fragis-Gaddis.
Thank you, Chair. A final question before I turn it over to Ms. Koutrakis. Prime Minister, to the point about youth and the Canada Student Service grants, in principle, of course, a great idea, a great vision. I am worried, though, about whether or not the program will come to fruition. I've asked this question to Minister Morneau, to Minister Chagger, to the Clerk of the Privy Council. I know colleagues might accuse me of repeating myself here, but we do have you at committee. I have many constituents anxious to volunteer. I have many not-for-profits and charities in the community of London, Ontario that want that volunteer effort as they try to deal with the challenge that is COVID-19. Will this program go ahead? If not, why not? And the money that was allocated towards it, if the program does not go ahead, where will that money go?
To the Prime Minister, if you can keep it pretty tight, sir.
Okay, of course, quickly. First of all, young people are right now volunteering in their communities across the country. We're seeing young people step up in big ways to help out, to contribute in this time of crisis. What they won't be getting through this program is rewards or recognition for 1,000 hours of work or 4,000 or 5,000 hours of work. That was what we were trying to encourage young people to do, even more volunteering that way. However, at the same time, we continue to look for ways to encourage volunteerism, to encourage young people to get involved. I know that Minister Chagger continues to work very hard on that, and I am hopeful that we will be able to continue to support young people in volunteerism as we're supporting them with both the emergency benefit for students and with lots of jobs for students through the summer jobs program.
Ms. Koutrakis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm having technical issues here, sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Prime Minister, for accepting to come to our committee this afternoon to clarify some real important issues for all Canadians. Let's remind ourselves the grave and unprecedented crisis that you and our government had to deal with in a real hurry, as you yourself said, to ensure the safety of Canadians and to save our economy. My question to you is, there's been a suggestion that We Charity started to pay your mother in 2016 because of your role as Prime Minister. Can you please speak to your mother's personal experience, her advocacy and commitment to mental health before you were elected as Prime Minister in 2015, and her qualifications as a speaker on this issue? And as a follow-up, because I know I'm short for time, did you at any time encourage your mother to be involved in the We organization or other charitable causes?
Mr. Prime Minister.
My mother has had a fascinating but challenging life in many ways, and she shared that story in her 2010 autobiography. After that, she started speaking and sharing stories and encouraging different organizations who are working particularly in mental health, but in other areas. As she did that, she realized there is a need and a demand for more destigmatization around mental health issues and better advocacy for it. So she actually wrote another book called Time of My Life that is focused on mental health issues, which she published in 2015. Around publishing that book, which also involved working with doctors and experts around in the field of mental health. She has been empowering people and supporting organizations across the country professionally for a long time since then. With the greater focus on mental health that has come over the past 5 years, it is not a surprise at all that various organizations would turn to her expertise and her involvement, but I never directly or indirectly encouraged her to work for we or any other specific organization.
Okay, we will have to go on to Mr. Fortin. Mr. Fortin, 6 minutes and your mic is muted, sir. There you go.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Premier ministre, est-ce qu'à un moment donné ou un autre, au cours de vos relations avec We Charity au cours des derniers mois, est-ce que vous avez vérifié au registre des lobbyistes pour vous assurer que les gens avec qui le gouvernement faisait affaire étaient bien inscrits au registre des lobbyistes?
D'abord, moi, personnellement, je n'ai eu aucune interaction avec des gens de Oui au cours des derniers mois et je m'attends à ce que les ministres qui ont eu des engagements avec différents organismes fassent la job de vérifier par rapport au commissaire des lobbyistes.
OK, je comprends que vous, personnellement, vous n'avez pas vérifié et vous n'avez pas non plus demandé à votre chef de cabinet de le faire.
Ma chef de cabinet n'a pas non plus eu d'interaction avec l'organisme uni.
Mais la question est, est-ce que vous avez demandé de vérifier si les Kielburger ou d'autres membres du CA étaient inscrits au registre?
Mais on n'a pas eu d'interaction, ni moi, ni ma chef de cabinet.
Donc, vous ne lui avez pas demandé de vérifier ça. Vous savez que des gens quand même du cabinet, on sait que M. Morneau et sa famille ont été en voyage avec les Kielburger. Votre famille a eu des liens avec eux, au-delà de la question de savoir si c'était correct ou pas, qu'ils donnent des conférences et tout ça. Il en demeure pas moins qu'il y avait des liens assez étroits entre, pour se le dire, là, entre la famille Trudeau et les gens de We Charity. C'était des liens proches. Mais vous n'avez jamais vérifié au registre des lobbyistes cette question-là? Et jamais demandé à quelqu'un de votre entourage de le faire?
D'abord, M. Fortin, vous parliez de liens proches avec les Kielburger. Je ne suis pas ami avec les Kielburger, je les connais, mais il n'y a pas de lien proche par rapport à ça. Oui, ça fait longtemps que je travaille dans le domaine de la jeunesse, bien avant la politique. Alors, j'ai une connaissance de ce qu'ils ont fait. J'ai participé à leurs événements plusieurs fois au cours de ma vie de premier ministre et avant. Mais par rapport au commissaire de lobbyiste, vous savez très bien que c'est aux individus et aux entreprises d'engager à ce niveau-là et pas nécessairement la responsabilité du côté politique de faire ces vérifications-là.
À votre avis, vous n'avez pas l'obligation, quand quelqu'un vous approche ou approche un membre de votre cabinet, vous n'avez pas l'obligation de vous assurer qu'ils sont inscrits au registre?
Quand on a une rencontre pour le lobbyiste, pour faire du lobbying, oui, absolument, mais il n'y a pas eu d'occasion où les Kielburger ou quiconque de Oui a eu des engagements de lobbying avec mon gouvernement depuis, peut-être pas jamais, mais certainement pas depuis dans les derniers mois.
Combien de millions de dollars ont été versés à We Charity ou un organisme du réseau Oui depuis votre élection en 2015, M. Trudeau?
Je sais que c'est plusieurs millions de dollars, mais je peux aussi souligner que les gouvernements précédents, conservateurs, des gouvernements des provinces ont aussi eu des engagements et des contrats avec cet organisme qui fait un travail remarquable pour des jeunes à travers le pays.
Moi, je ne fais pas le procès de We Charity. La question que je me pose, c'est est-ce que notre argent est bien géré ou pas? Et vous comprendrez qu'il y a des questions qui nous apparaissent importantes. Mais je reviens au registre des lobbyistes. Je comprends que depuis 2015, depuis votre arrivée en tant que premier ministre, il y a eu des millions. Là, moi, je voyais des chiffres tantôt, 5, 10, on ne sait plus trop, là, mais des millions de dollars ont été versés à We Charity. Et vous saviez, j'imagine, que M. Morneau avait été en voyage avec les gens de Oui il n'y a pas longtemps?
D'abord, par rapport à votre question sur les contributions à We Charity, mon bureau ni moi-même n'avons été impliqués dans aucun de ces ententes avec l'organisme uni. Et par rapport à M. Morneau, non, je ne savais pas particulièrement qu'il avait été en voyage avec Oui, mais je savais qu'il y avait une fille qui était impliquée, pas celle qui travaillait pour, mais une autre qui était impliquée avec cet organisme d'une façon ou d'une autre.
Monsieur Trudeau, Monsieur le Premier ministre, qu'est-ce que ça veut dire? Je ne savais pas particulièrement. que M. Morneau avait été en voyage. Vous le saviez pas ou vous le saviez, mais pas particulièrement? Ça veut dire quoi, au juste?
Ça me surprend pas parce que je sais à quel point M. Morneau est impliqué dans bien des causes, y compris des causes pour de la jeunesse. Mais non, je ne savais pas qu'il avait pris précisément un voyage avec Oui.
OK. Mais vous saviez donc que sa fille avait travaillé pour Oui?
Non, excusez-moi. Je savais qu'une de ses filles avait fait des projets avec Oui. Elle avait écrit d'ailleurs un livre sur l'engagement des femmes que j'avais reçu à un moment donné. Mais je ne savais pas qu'il y avait une autre fille qui travaillait comme telle pour l'organisme.
Avez-vous demandé à M. Morneau si...
You have a minute left, Mr. Fortin. 1 minute left.
Merci, M. le Président. Monsieur le Premier ministre, avez-vous demandé à M. Morneau, à un moment donné ou à un autre, de s'assurer que les gens de We Charity étaient bien inscrits au registre des lobbyistes?
Puisque je ne savais pas qu'il y avait des interactions avec We Charity par rapport à ce programme lié à la COVID, je n'aurais pas eu occasion ou raison de poser des questions sur le lobbying et les Kielburger.
Avez-vous posé la question à Mme Chagger?
Comme j'ai dit, je ne savais pas que l'organisme We Charity avait été choisi pour livrer ce programme pendant le processus qui se déroulait. Alors, il n'y aurait pas eu une question de demander par rapport au lobbying.
Vous avez annoncé, je crois que c'est le 29 avril, le programme, et tout de suite après, We Charity est arrivé. À un moment donné, les liens, vous savez que We Charity est dans le décor depuis longtemps. Vous n'avez jamais demandé à aucun de vos ministres ou de votre staff de vérifier si We Charity était inscrit au registre des lobbyistes. À personne. À votre connaissance, à vous?
D'abord, ce n'est pas le rôle du premier ministre de demander à tous ses ministres par rapport à du lobbying. On a des gens dans nos bureaux pour s'occuper de ça et je m'attends à ce qu'ils fassent leur job. Deuxièmement, l'implication de We Charity, je ne l'ai su que le 8 mai, une fois que toutes ces décisions et ces recommandations avaient été prises par la fonction publique.
Sorry, Mr. Fortin, we're a little over. We'll turn to Mr. Angus for 6 minutes, who will be followed by Mr. Polyev and then Mr. McLeod. Mr. Angus.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for joining us today. I agree with you. Canadians are in the worst medical and economic catastrophe in a century. And I think what's very frustrating for me is that we've worked very hard across party lines to reassure Canadians that we are putting their interests first. And yet we're here today because of this, I think, very unnecessary scandal. And it comes down fundamentally to a question of your judgment. I mean, there were numerous red flags with this proposal. It fell apart the second it was announced. But the question that sticks with people is you've been found guilty twice of breaking the Conflict Interest Act. That you seem to have this, you give an impression anyways, that you don't believe that the laws that define what politicians can and cannot do applies to you. And so here we are with a case that was such an obvious conflict of interest because of your connection with the Kielburgers that has derailed so much good work and hurt students. Do you recognize what you've done here and the damage that's been done to all of us trying to reassure Canadians?
Mr. Prime Minister.
First of all, Mr. Angus, through this pandemic that, as you say, has been extraordinarily difficult and impactful on Canadians, we have remained focused on them. We have delivered to over 8 million Canadians the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, a wage subsidy that has kept businesses going, commercial rent assistance, support for seniors, support for students, a $9 billion package, of which, yes, this volunteer program was a part. And it is disappointing that we're not going to be able to give grants for students who are volunteering across the country so far, and we still are working on that, obviously. But at the same time, Mr. Angus, you need to know that we have delivered concretely for Canadians. We also, when I received the information that the We Charity was being chosen, recommended by Public Service to deliver the student grant program, I pushed back, perhaps because of the experience that you highlight that we have had pushbacks in the past. Yeah. So I wanted to make sure that all the I's were dotted, all the T's were crossed, that the Public Service was ready to fully justify that choice of We Charity as the only organization.
We'll have to go back to Mr. Angus,
Thank
Prime
you.
Minister.
I guess the issue is that for Canadians, the idea that this was the only game in town, that we was the only game in town, I'm sure around your cabinet it probably was. But the fact is that the Kielburger brothers carefully cultivated their relationship with you and your brand. After you became Prime Minister, they put you on the stadium circuit. They hired your family members to the tune of $500,000. They hired the finance minister's daughter. They flew him around the world. They even made their staff go to his parties. Do you think that that's not conflict of interest? Is that conflict of interest, yes or no?
Okay, from the very first, Mr. Angus, you were unfortunately misleading people with your proposal. This was not something that we selected. This is not something that Cabinet selected. Cabinet was presented a choice by our professional public service saying, if you want to deliver this summer volunteer program, the summer grant program, it's going to have to be with this through this third-party organization. They didn't give us a choice of 2 or 3 different organizations. So when you say that it was maybe the reality around the cabinet table, but it wasn't necessarily the reality out there, you're actually impugning the very fine public servants who have
Mr.
done
Trudeau,
extraordinary work across this pandemic on delivering for Canadians.
Yes.
And if they said there is no other organization that can deliver the scale of grants
back to Mr. Angus, Prime
then
Minister.
I believe
Thank you. Well, Mr. Prime Minister, I totally agree with you about the civil service. That's why your decision to privatize this and give it to the Kielburger brothers really concerns me. And what really concerns me is you didn't answer the question about whether or not that you thought that your close family financial relationships and the Morneau family close financial relationships is a conflict of interest. That is why we're here. We're not here because of the civil service. We're here because you don't seem to understand, Mr. Prime Minister, that conflict of interest applies to you. So when you tell us that We Charity was the only game in town, well, they were in your world. But obviously this deal fell apart, and you need to understand that your conflict of interest has put you here.
Mr. Prime Minister.
Mr. Angus, your statement that in my world or in our cabinet, we were the only game in town is simply untrue. It is
That's what you said.
Professional public service that put forward the recommendation that said to us, having done their due diligence, that the only organization with the scale and the capacity to deliver this grant program would be we. Personally, I thought we were going to be able to deliver it through the Canada Service Corps, which I created 2 or 3 years ago and was all about rewarding service and creating opportunities for service for young people. I would have loved to seen it supercharged and accelerated to be able to deliver many thousands of opportunities for young people throughout the country. But that wasn't able to be done. And the public service themselves made the recommendation that we had to go with We Charity. And I was not involved in that
last
recommendation
question,
at all,
Mr. Angus, and it'll have to be a very quick one.
Well, very quickly, Mr. Prime Minister, as the former youth voice, you could have been talking to the Federation of Students when you were telling them that they were not eligible for CERB, when you told them to work for less than the minimum wage, when you pushed this deal with the Kielburger brothers and refused to recuse yourself, and not a dime has gone out the door.
Over to you, Mr. Prime Minister.
Thank you. Mr. Angus and the NDP have said this a few times, this idea that volunteering is somehow working for less than the minimum wage. I'd like to remind Mr. Angus that
Mr. Angus, the Prime Minister has the floor.
The heart of this country. And people get out and volunteer not for money, but because they want to make a difference in the world. And if you start calculating every volunteer as working for less than the minimum wage, then you are missing a really important part, Mr. Angus, of the fabric of Canada. And getting young people to step up and volunteer is something
we will have to end that round there, gentlemen. We are going now to 5-minute rounds, and we'll start with Mr. Poilievre, followed by Mr. McLeod. Mr. Poilievre, 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, I'll be taking Mr. Poilievre's time.
Oh, okay. Who was that yelled there?
MP Barrett, sir.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Mr. Barrett. Yeah, I had Mr. Poilievre on my list. I'll not take my talking from your time. You get the floor.
Thank you. Prime Minister, just looking for a number. How many times would one of your ministers need to be found guilty of breaking the Conflict of Interest Act for you to fire them? How many times, sir?
Obviously, our cabinet is formed of extraordinary individuals who serve their country, and I have confidence in their ability to do just that.
How many times would they need to break the act before you would fire them?
Obviously, anytime someone contravenes the Ethics Commissioners Act, we take it very seriously, and we'll look at each situation based on the gravity of the situation.
Okay, well, you claimed in your opening remarks that you had basically no idea what was happening in your government. Who are you holding accountable for this decision?
Mr. Barrett, over the past number of months, as a government and as a prime minister, I've been involved in the decisions around CERB, around the wage subsidy, around helping Canadians through this extraordinary time of crisis. We've been involved in working quickly and flexibly with an extraordinarily professional public service to deliver tremendous programs to help Canadians.
We will have to go back to Mr. Barrett,
every
Prime
aspect
Minister.
of many of these programs.
Prime Minister, there was no vetting done of We Charity. There are major concerns with this organization. Who is responsible for the vetting?
The public service would have done their due diligence to ensure which organizations could deliver the program as we had laid it out. And they found that only We Charity had the ability to do that through their due diligence process.
Mr. Barrett.
The organization that you approved, sir, was, you had a massive contract given to a shell company with no experience running a government grant program. That's a problem. Someone should be held accountable. Who are you going to fire?
Mr. Prime Minister.
Mr. Barrett, the public service, which has delivered extraordinary programs, including with third-party organizations. When we wanted to help out shelters, we went through United Way. When we wanted to help food banks, the public service reached out to Food Banks Canada to make sure that they could get that money out. They have consistently worked with third-party organizations. As part of their decision to do that, they have done full due diligence on that organization's ability to deliver the program. And
Prime Minister,
Cabinet, they were capable of
Prime Minister,
this
Cabinet is responsible for decisions, not the public service. A major mistake was made. Someone in Cabinet should be held accountable. Which minister will you fire? Minister Morneau, Minister Chagger, which minister?
The decision in Cabinet was not as to which organization should deliver the Canada's student summer grants. The decision in Cabinet was, should we have a summer grants program or not? That was the binary choice given to us by the public service and the minister, and Cabinet made a decision that creating opportunities for young people to serve across the country.
Do you still think We was a good choice? Do you still think We was a good choice to run this program, sir?
We will never know, because they pulled out of that being able to deliver the program, partially because I hadn't recused myself and created complications here. And that's something that I deeply regret, because creating opportunities for young people to serve is something that matters deeply to all Canadians across the country.
Mr. Barrett, I'll not take the time from you, Mr. Barrett, but somebody's got their mic on and some sound is coming through. Okay, Mr. Barrett.
Were you aware that the We organization had fired its board chair shortly before they were given this contract?
No, I was not.
Were you aware that We had fired a very large portion of its staff?
No, I was not.
How many times did your family members receive remuneration from this organization since you've been elected as Prime Minister?
As I said, my wife works on an unpaid basis for We and other organizations, and had it cleared by the Ethics Commissioner in advance for both her engagement, because she's been an advocate and a TV and radio host professionally through her entire career, that her activities with this organization and other organizations for free, with being reimbursed for expenses, was something that was cleared by the Ethics Commissioner when she first wanted to become an advocate around these issues with that organization.
You have a minute left, Mr. Barrett.
So every dollar that your wife received in reimbursement or in payment was cleared in advance by the commissioner.
As I said, Mr. Barrett, this was unpaid work my wife was doing for a cause that she believes in deeply, talking about destigmatization of mental health, empowerment of young people, particularly girls. This is something that she believed in deeply. And yes, we got approval by the Ethics Commissioner that she could volunteer with this organization and have expenses related to that volunteerism reimbursed.
So I want to go.
Question, keep it tight.
Well, I want to know if the Prime Minister can tell us what due diligence looks like. We have an organization that had no assets. It was a shell corporation. They were in violation of bank covenants, a fired board chair. They were firing employees, and the government of Canada handed over a $500 million contract for them to administer. What was that due diligence that was done, sir?
The public service ensures that any third-party partner that we work with on delivery of a program is capable of delivering the program. They have a rigorous and strong process to do that. And I have confidence in our public service to be able to do that, particularly because during this time of pandemic, they had demonstrated with many third-party organizations an ability to get help to Canadians in record fashion when people needed it the most.
Thank you both. Turning then to Mr. McLeod, who will be followed by Mr. Polyev on my list. Mr. McLeod, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the Prime Minister for joining us here today. I'm glad that when the question was brought to the Cabinet table to run a summer student program, you said yes, because I think it's very important that we do so. And I think that's something we should continue to try to achieve. This is our 5th meeting on the topic of government spending. We and the Canada Summer Student Service Grant. Throughout this whole study, my greatest concern is that for the whole month since it was determined that we was no longer going to administer the program is now in jeopardy. That is one whole month that the youth have missed out on experiences and assistance that the Canada Student Service Grant could have provided. In many parts of the country, including here in the North, I'm the Member of Parliament for Northwest Territories, for those that don't know, and Indigenous communities, many of our youth already face many barriers to opportunities that other parts of the country enjoy. We are remote. We struggle with connectivity. There's a high cost of living. And I need to ask you if the government is going to address the fact that our youth have lost out because of this delay.
Mr. Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. McLeod, for your words and, quite frankly, for your advocacy for Northern youth and indeed all youth across the country. I share those concerns, and that's why we move forward with multiple ways to support young people through this pandemic. We looked at a $9 billion package to support young people that includes deferral of student loans, that includes creation of summer jobs and opportunities for them at a time where we know that their regular summer jobs may not exist because of the pandemic. And it also included the Canada Emergency Student Response Benefit that gives $1,250 per month to students who need it. $2,000 a month to students who have dependents. And that was something that we worked out with other parties as well. So there are many, many different things we're doing for young people. This particular program, the Canada Student Service Grant, was created to incentivize and to reward young people who are stepping up in their communities. It was about giving a grant to young people for that service that they were so many of them doing already. What we continue to see, even without this financial reward we would have been able to deliver and the coordination across the country, we see young people in the North and the South, right across the country, stepping up and volunteering in community organizations because they know that this is a historic time in which their actions, their voices, their efforts can shape our country for the better. And again, I am always deeply grateful to young people and their leadership within our country.
Mr. McLeod.
Yeah, thank you for that response. I heard your response to my colleague when he asked about this program earlier, and I'm hoping that I can use this opportunity to encourage the delivery of this program, maybe through the public service instead, and consideration to adjusting the original eligibility period to sometime down the road into October, or perhaps reprofiling the grant funding into another program to support young Canadians. Is that something Cabinet would be interested in talking about?
Absolutely. We know that we need to do more for young people, and encouraging young people to volunteer and be involved in their communities is a great way, not just of giving them experiences and opportunity, but of actually tangibly helping out seniors, young people, marginalized people, community organizations. These are things that young people, young students stepping up can make a huge difference in. So we're going to continue to look for ways to do it. Like I said, the Canada Student Corps, which was created a few years ago, is exactly about that, about coordinating volunteer organizations to create opportunities for young people across the country. It wasn't able to scale up in a way that allowed the public service to choose it to deliver this CSSG program. But as we continue to look for other ways to deliver the CSSG, I know that the Canada Service Corps, which is internal to government, is something that people are looking at very carefully.
You'll have to split 30 seconds with the Prime Minister, Mr. McLeod.
I just wanted to ask if you could just lay out some of the challenges that the Canada Service Corps program faced that made them unable to deliver the program initially.
Very quickly, Prime Minister.
We were hoping to launch a first pilot project with about 7,000 volunteers this coming September as a way of starting the activities of the Canada Service Corps in a tangible way. That's a far cry from the tens of thousands of volunteers that we would have needed or would have wanted through this program to give grants to in this time of pandemic. It was a scale problem and a program delivery program challenge.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Polyev, who will be followed by Ms. Zerowitz. Mr. Polyev, 5 minutes, please.
Yes or no question, Mr. Chair. Prime Minister, you twice were found guilty of breaking the Ethics Act. After those two convictions, did you decide to read the Act?
You got 14 seconds, Prime Minister.
Yes, I have read the Act a number of times.
Are you aware of Section 21?
Yes, since I've read the Act, I'm aware of Section 21.
What does it say?
I can pull it up for you, but if you have it in front of you, you can remind me which.
Well, it says a public office holder, of which you are one, shall recuse himself or herself from any discussion, decision, debate, or vote in any matter in which, in respect of which he or she would be in a conflict of interest. Now, what you've admitted today is not just that you were in a conflict of interest, but that you consciously recognized in your May cabinet meeting that such a conflict might exist. That it didn't just slide by your desk, that you were consciously aware that there was an inappropriate link to your family that would put you in a conflict. Why did you, at that moment, not call the ethics commissioner and recuse yourself?
That is simply not true, Mr. Polyev. The issue of advancing issues for one's own family. And by the way, the ethics commissioner is looking into this right now, and I fully trust his judgment on determining it. But at the same time, my concern around recusing myself was a question around perceptions, because I knew full well that this Canada Summer Students Grant Program was not going to directly benefit my mother or my brother.
Your 16 seconds are up. Your 16 seconds are up. I'm going to ask you again, because nobody believes you when you say you don't know how much money your family has got from the We Group. So you've had a month to look into that. You knew you were going to testify here. Again, how much money total have your brother, mother, and spouse received from this organization? How much?
That information has been publicly shared, but I will highlight.
Well, then tell me what it is.
My mother
how much?
has
just the dollar figure
throughout her life.
The dollar figure, Prime Minister.
Various ways, and is proud
how much
of the work that she's done, and I'm proud of her.
How
as
much? I'm looking for a dollar figure.
We can get that number for you if you like. It's been out in the media.
It's been in the media, but you don't know it?
I don't have it in front of me. And quite
you don't
frankly,
know how much your family has received from this organization, which you tried to give $500 million. Really?
Can I answer, Mr. Polyev?
I'm waiting. You haven't done an answer so far. Let's make this the first one.
My mother has worked as an advocate.
The dollar figure, Prime Minister.
Speaker for many good organizations across the country.
Mr. Prime Minister, you are being asked a direct question at a parliamentary committee.
To support her because she does her own work, and I'm proud of the work that she does. Point of order. But I do not feel that it is my responsibility to peer into the work my mother is doing, because I have
point of order to suspend
that she's doing.
Point of
order to suspend.
I've come to learn that the chairperson's power has gone out and is no longer part of this meeting. May I propose that we?
It's okay. We can keep. Prime Minister and I can continue talking.
No.
I suspected that might be a problem. It's very convenient timing for the lights to go out.
Look, I got a message to the effect that his power has gone out. I have no reason to distrust him.
I hope you don't pull the fire alarm now.
Yeah, well, look, there's no intent in my own private home here in the middle of a pandemic. I don't have a fire alarm. I propose
the general process is that the vice chair assumes the chairing of the meeting. So we'll continue.
And that would be me. So we'll continue the meeting, and I now give the floor to the member for Carleton. Mr. Prime Minister, you have, I'm going to ask you one last time, how much did your family get from this organization? How much?
Have you read the Conflict of Interest Act, Mr.
Yes,
Polyev?
I have.
How does it define family?
I'm asking you.
How does it define
I'm asking
family?
you how much your family got.
The Conflict of Interest Act defines family as spouse and direct dependents.
Point of order.
So you're not going to answer that question.
Point of order.
So you're not going to answer the question then. So you're not going to answer the question about how much your family received. Okay, you're right.
Older gentleman, if you.
For working with we, and it was cleared by the Ethics Commissioner ahead of time.
Okay.
Mr. Point of order, can I welcome back Wayne Easter? Can I welcome back Wayne Easter, a man we've deeply missed? Come on, Wayne, where have you been? Were you coffee?
Look,
I had things under control for you while you were gone.
I imagine that, Wayne. Pierre, it wouldn't be the first time you tried to put my lights out, and that's exactly what happened, Pierre. We get a thunderstorm here. Anyway, where will you're well into your 5 minutes, but go with one last question.
Mr. Trudeau, I'm going to conclude by asking you. You claim that you have no knowledge of the amount that has been paid in expenses to your spouse. You correctly pointed out that the Act defines family as including a spouse. Therefore, you know you're under investigation regarding the Act. I'm going to ask you again, how much in total, and I'm looking for a dollar figure here, sir, how much did your spouse receive in reimbursed expenses or other benefits from this organization? How much?
Your original question, Mr. Polyev, was how much was my immediate family?
I asked you a different question now. How much?
Mr. Polyev, the Prime Minister has the floor.
My wife has never been paid since I was Prime Minister.
Reimbursed for expenses.
Mr. Polyev, could we please have order? We'll allow the Prime Minister to answer the question, and then we'll move on to Ms. Zerowitz. Sorry, Julie. Mr. Prime Minister, you have about 30 seconds here.
The Ethics Commissioner has fully cleared my wife to continue her advocacy and her work with We Charity and other organizations.
How much?
In the kind of work that she's been doing all her life.
Just the dollar figure.
She's doing it unpaid for We. She is not being paid by We for her advocacy or for her podcasts. They are simply reimbursing her for expenses.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister and Mr. Polyev, and I'm sorry for leaving the line. We'll go to Ms. Zerowitz next, and then we'll be followed by Ms. Goodrow, Mary Helen, and then Mr. Angus. So Ms. Zerowitz, 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Oh, Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And you're always calling me Mr.
I know that.
Anyways, Prime Minister, I want to say a huge thanks to you for being here today. I also want to say a heartfelt thanks on behalf of Davenport residents, particularly during the early days of the pandemic. The daily announcements that you made were a lifeline for them, both in terms of information and in terms of the support that we were providing. They really received the feeling that we had their back. And so I want to say a huge thanks to you. The first thing I want to talk about is just about recusing yourself. You had indicated that you felt you should have recused yourself because of the perception. I want to ask a question. If you were to recuse yourself from every decision that might indirectly impact your family, how would that affect your ability to serve as Prime Minister and MP for Papineau?
You're muted. There you go.
Thank you, Chair. I think obviously that is an important question. There are many things I do and we do as a government that impact millions of Canadians across the country. For example, my mother is a long and well-known long-standing advocate for mental health issues. One of the very first commitments we made to Canadians was to invest $5 billion into mental health supports across the provinces. It is possible that I shouldn't have been involved in that decision because my mom is a well-known advocate and works in the mental health universe. Obviously, that would be silly. It is not a conflict, but these kinds of things constantly come up. That's why when the issue of we came forward, my concern was to push back on it, to delay it from going forward to cabinet so that more due diligence could happen. In that case, looking back on it, it would have been better had, for perception's sake, I simply step away and not be involved at all, and perhaps the organization and the program would be delivered right now. But I always look to try and serve Canadians the best possible way. And around youth programs, I have a level of experience on that meant that I felt that I was useful in contributing, and that none of this program was in any way going to benefit any members of my family. And that was something that I was very comfortable with.
Thank you. My next question is, you've made it clear, there were a number of questions around board governance for We and the number of layoffs that had taken place at We Charity. And you'd clearly articulated for Canadians and anyone listening that the due diligence is the responsibility of us, our civil service. I did want to ask, though, Mr. Shrugat testified that no one in the public service raised any red flags about the We Charity's financial well-being. So I wanted to just directly ask you, did you see or hear any red flags being raised about the We Charity's finances and the resources? And the second part of my question is, you had asked Minister Chagger to speak with the head of Treasury Board for some additional oversight. So if you could sort of talk to both of those, because I see a bit of a correlation there.
Obviously, there are now certain media reporting and questions about the We organization's financial structures and activities. Those obviously weren't public knowledge and weren't flagged to me at any point during the May 8th conversation or the May 21st or 22nd conversation. In regards to the extra oversight, I recommended we bring in between Minister Chagger and the Treasury Board. That was to lay out the payments to this third-party We organization for delivering the program in specific tranches that would provide an update before further funds were flowed once they worked through the initial cohorts.
Thank you.
And then question, Julie.
Thank you. So Minister Morneau had mentioned to us that over 70 emergency programs were introduced with a spend of over $200 billion. Can you give Canadians an idea about what is your involvement in the big policy decisions that come before Cabinet?
Through the months of April and May specifically, I was working all day on policy briefs and design for the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, for the wage subsidy, for supports for Canadians, for responding to PPE challenges. It was a time of extraordinary activity for the government as the civil service stepped up to deliver things that had never been done before in timeframes that would have been unimaginable. and as a cabinet and as a prime minister, we were tremendously active in this time, because we knew that Canadians were counting on us to be there for them as we asked them to do extremely difficult things, to leave their jobs, to stay home, to hunker down so we could defeat this virus or slow this virus. We needed to be there for them, and we were deeply involved in every aspect of how we move forward.
We will have to move on, Prime Minister. I have Ms. Goodrow next, then Mr. Angus.
Oui, bonjour, Monsieur le Président. J'aimerais laisser mon temps à mon collègue, Monsieur Fortin.
Okay. We're going to Mr. Fortin. Before you start, Rial, for the official opposition, we will have a slot open, and then we will end the day. Okay, Mr. Poilievre will be on, and we'll end with Mr. Fraser. Mr. Fortin,
Merci,
2.5 minutes.
Monsieur Trudeau, ça n'aurait pas été plus simple le 29 avril, quand vous avez annoncé le programme.
I didn't know that We Charity was involved in this.
I didn't realize that they were involved in this program on April 29th, rather. The decision hadn't been made yet. You didn't announce that you had ties with We. And on April 22nd, Mr. Kielburger said there wasn't a call from your office and seemed to suggest this. Mr. Fortin, you do not have the correct dates. At the end of the line, Mr. Trudeau, do you not feel that you betrayed the trust of Quebecers and all Canadians by acting in such a manner? And acting in what manner? You excused yourself and even delayed the decision to make the choice of We Charity because you knew you'd be subject to scrutiny. Even though you knew, you never recused yourself from the decision table, and you knew that when you'd be voting at the cabinet table, that this would be an issue. Quebecers feel betrayed, Mr. Trudeau. Mr. Fortin, I was not in a position of conflict of interest. And why did you apologize? I apologize because of the perception that ties with my family would have been, I should have recused myself. You're saying that today, but you know full well. Question, how come you didn't do so at the beginning?
Mr. Prime Minister, the floor is yours.
You knew that we had to rapidly deliver innovative programs to help people who were in a tough situation, and that's exactly what we did. As I said, I didn't know that We Charity was chosen. Mr. Trudeau, you were blamed in the SNC Lavalin affair and other affairs, and now you're being blamed for this. When will you decide to step aside and ask Mr. Morneau to step down as finance minister? You said that the lobbyist register wasn't your job to look at, but answer, Mr. Fortin, since the past 4 or 5 months, the government and the Minister of Finance in particular has delivered assistance to millions and millions of Canadians who were in a very tough situation.
The floor is the Prime Minister's. If he could finish, please.
We had to make enormous differences for Canadians, and that's what we were focused on. That's very disappointing, Mr. Trudeau.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, Mr. Fortin. Mr. Angus, 2.5 minutes, and then on to Mr. Poilievre. Mr. Angus.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Prime Minister, 2017, after you're found guilty with the Aga Khan deal, you said, we are going to work with the Office of the Ethics Commissioner in the new year to ensure that as we go forward in full and complete compliance with the rules in place. You tell us that you held this project back, you did the due diligence, you were aware that there were perceptions that might be problematic. We're not talking about perceptions, we're talking about breaches of the law. In your due diligence, why did you not bother to talk to the Conflict of Interest Commissioner? It is so obvious, Mr. Trudeau, that these conflicts were there. Why did you think it didn't apply to you?
Mr. Prime Minister.
Mr. Angus, the public service came forward with a recommendation to Cabinet to move forward either with this specific third-party provider that was We Charity, or else not move forward with the program at all. That was the binary choice we proposed. I did not influence the public service to choose this organization. And indeed, when the public service came forward with this organization, I said, you know what? Let's put the brakes on it. Let's make sure that it's done absolutely everything right, because there are going to be questions because of the connections with my family on this. Yes, in hindsight, I should have recused myself, and perhaps that the program would be delivering for students right across the country right now. But I did not. Instead, I put the brakes on it and said, let's make sure that it is doing things the right way so that we don't have any communications or public problems.
Back to Mr. Angus.
I guess with all due respect, instead of continually throwing the civil service under the bus, I'm asking about your judgment, about your legal obligations, because the real losers here are the young people. Statistics Canada says that it's going to take 5 to 7 years for them to recover from the damage. And we had students asking why they were being denied CERB, asking why you were telling them that volunteerism is going to be great, they can work for less than minimum wage. You know, for students who have massive levels of student debt, they don't got $41,000 checks to cover up their losses. They were looking to you as their champion. And I'm really concerned, Mr. Prime Minister, that you think this issue of paying students, university students, a fair wage is somehow an attack on volunteerism. To be the champion of youth isn't to do a high five with Craig Kielburger.
Mr. Angus, your question, please.
Sure, because none of the money got out, not a dime. These students are still waiting. You failed them.
Mr. Prime Minister.
I'm happy to correct Mr. Angus. The Canada Emergency Student Benefit since May 15th has given to 724,000 applicants a total value of $2.1 billion directly for students. That's part of the $9 billion package. The student CERB has made a huge difference. The summer jobs we've created, the deferral of student loans. Yes, I regret that we weren't able to put out
Mr. Angus, the Prime Minister has the floor.
To recognize volunteerism that young people are doing right across the country. That is a piece of it that is disappointing and that I regret and I apologize for. But the ensemble of things that we've done to help students across this country in this historic pandemic has made a real difference in the lives of students and in communities across this country that are seeing young people step up and contribute.
We've had equal time, Prime Minister. We'll have to move on to Mr. Polyev, and the concluding questions will go to Mr. Fraser. You have 5 minutes, Mr. Polyev, and please don't shut my lights out this time, will you? Go ahead, Pierre.
Don't shut your own out either. You claimed that the program's purposes were threefold: help youth through the pandemic, help charities get through the pandemic, and help students pay for their post-secondary in the fall. Which of these could the Canada Summer Jobs Program not have done?
Actually, the 3 aims that I listed for the CSSG were encourage young people to step up, help out community organizations, and recognize volunteerism and reward volunteerism by students as a way of making a difference in this pandemic.
Back to Mr. Polyev.
So you can't name a single one of these objectives that could not have been fulfilled by the Canada Summer Jobs Program.
That's not true, Pierre. The third one, recognizing volunteerism, is not done by the Canada Summer Jobs
Recognizing paid volunteerism. So you called it volunteerism so that you could take it outside of the Canada Summer Jobs Program and give it to your friends at We. My next question: when you directed,
Mr. Polyev, the Prime Minister's got about 8 seconds to answer that one. Then we'll go to your question.
The CSSG was about recognizing and rewarding volunteerism. It's not about jobs. It was about volunteerism. And that, unfortunately, is something that we can't do because this program...
Back to Mr. Polyev.
You just misused the word so that you could justify outsourcing a program that already effectively exists within the government. Now, when you did that, you directed $500 million. And yes, you did. You were the head of the cabinet. Did you know that the group to which you were directing that $500 million was in violation of its bank covenant? Yes or no?
That is not something that we had as information at that point.
Did you know that the government money would go into a real estate shell foundation instead of into the We Charity? Yes or no?
the details on the payment were worked out by our professional public service in terms of how the contribution agreement flowed.
So did you know that the chair of the board had resigned? Yes or no?
No.
So you clearly did not do any due diligence of your own. As the chair of the cabinet responsible for approving a decision, you should have had some basic facts. Sir, you were using $500 million of taxpayers' money here. You had a fiduciary responsibility. Why didn't you ask these questions?
We have flowed tens of billions of dollars through the CERB, through the
question isn't about the
benefit,
CERB.
through various ways to help Canadians, and we were very, very active in making sure that flows right. There are many, many different programs, and in cabinet government, we trust the ministers and the public service to do their jobs and make sure that things are delivered in the right way. And in this case, they did.
Monsieur le Président, le temps est venu.
Mr. Chair, the Prime Minister needs to stop blaming civil servants. It was his decision.
Channel, because I can't make you out. I'm hearing two languages at once.
Le temps est venu.
It's time for the Prime Minister to stop blaming the public service. He is an elected official who is responsible toward Canadians, and he needs to ensure that money is spent properly. It's not up to public servants who are forced to spend nearly $500 million to a group that paid his family nearly $500,000. Will the Prime Minister take personal responsibility for approving this enormous amount, which was given out to his friends? First of all, I'd like to make something clear. I have nothing but admiration and respect and deep gratitude for the public service, which is professional and has been able to deliver extraordinary programs during this pandemic to help millions of Canadians. It has had a real impact on the work that they're doing, and it continues to do this work. Their excellence was applied to programs for youth, and I have confidence that they made the right recommendation to deliver this program in the best way possible. And unfortunately, in part because I did not recuse myself, there was a perception that led to not being able to deliver this specific program. But the suite of programs that we deliver to Canadians, I have a simple question for you. How many times did a minister in your government need to break the Ethics Act before being sacked? How many times? We take it very seriously every time there are ethics issues. How many times? And how many times?
And he has the right to answer. Mr. Prime Minister.
We will obviously
how many times?
Any breaches of official codes. We will ensure that there are consequences, and we will look at every situation differently.
Fine. In English, I'll ask my last question.
Your last question is over. You're over your 5 minutes. Last night, you people were giving me the gears for not sticking and adhering to time. I'm adhering to time today. Mr. Fraser, you have the last round, 5 minutes, and then the Prime Minister will be released.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Prime Minister. Before I begin, I do want to express my gratitude for your assistance in securing a public inquiry into the mass shootings that took place in my home province of Nova Scotia. It means to the world to us at home. To the matter at hand, you've acknowledged during this meeting and previously that you should have recused yourself from the decision. I appreciate your willingness to admit that. You've also mentioned when it first came up at Cabinet, you pushed back. I've got competing concepts of a need to conduct due diligence and at the same time to have recused yourself. Of course, you remain responsible for the oversight of the policy direction and program implementation of the Government of Canada. And though I believe you were right to say you probably should have recused yourself from that conversation, I have difficulty how you would have simultaneously exercised the kind of oversight that caused you to push back during that May 8th meeting. Had you recused yourself, how would this additional oversight had taken place if you had not been involved in the process of the discussion at the Cabinet table?
That is an excellent question. the quick answer is that other members of cabinet would have stepped up and ensured proper oversight. But you do highlight one of the challenges of making policy in as condensed a fashion as we have during this pandemic. We have been flowing aid to Canadians, to different groups, filling gaps across the country with innovative partnerships, with creative ways of approaching things, because we needed to be there for Canadians. So yes, things were truncated, things were shortened. Programs that would have taken 6 months to develop and deliver were instead done in the matter of weeks. So it was a particularly challenging situation. And if you'll allow me, Mr. Fraser, let me also say thank you to you and to your fellow Nova Scotia MPs for being so strong in your advocacy to make sure that the answers get given to those families. Your leadership on this has been both personally and professionally appreciated.
Thank you very much. So the process that we've learned to date, that there was a public service recommendation. We learned 2 days ago when the Kielburgers were at committee that the public service actually recommended that they adopt a new foundation, essentially, or at least approved a new foundation to have the flow-through money to make sure that the We Charity was willing to accept liability. They said only a third party can do it. I understand, to your point about other members of cabinet providing that oversight, that it would have gone to cabinet committee before it came to full cabinet made, where you still pushed back. So I'm curious, it sounded like your reservation was about the possibility that there might be a perception that your family or people close to you would have directly or indirectly benefited. Were you satisfied when it came back to cabinet, when this was finally approved, that there was no possibility that your family directly or indirectly was actually going to benefit from the Canada Student Service Grant Program?
Yes, there is no way that my family would have benefited from these grants to students across the country.
Thank you, Prime Minister. So back to the matter at hand, I got to say, I was a former youth leader. I took part in different programs, the Canada Summer Jobs Program, student government, and the like. It hugely shaped who I am. I want to build on Mr. McLeod's line of questioning. Where do we go from here? I actually still very much support the values that you outlined behind the Student Service Grant Program. I understand there's going to be difficulties over the course of this summer implementing something that would provide that kind of opportunity. What's the next step? How do we actually get this program or some other support on the rails to actually provide the kind of support to students that you have clearly communicated as being important to this government?
And your answer, we'll have to wrap it up, Prime Minister.
First of all, throughout this pandemic, we've had to deliver certain things and suspend other things. Our priority has been on helping people through this pandemic, and that really needed to be our priority, particularly for students, which is why we put out the Student CERB, which is why we've created new jobs, which is why we're deferring student loans. This was an additional way for young people to be involved, to volunteer, to reward volunteerism for young people throughout the country. And it is still a goal of this government. That's why we created the Canada Service Corps a number of years ago. Youth volunteerism actually is one of the things that brought me into politics a dozen years ago, because I was working with Katimovic and realized that we needed to do more youth volunteerism and youth service in this country. So it will continue to be a goal of mine, and something that really is important for the country, to see young people stepping up in their communities, helping out people who need help, discovering the value of service and becoming engaged, active citizens in their communities, in their country for the rest of their lives. This was an opportunity to fit it into a COVID context. But even as COVID continues, and even beyond COVID, getting young people to serve in their communities will always remain a goal for this government.
Okay, with that, on behalf of the committee, Prime Minister, I thank you for first appearing before the committee and taking the extra time, the extra 30 minutes to, 32 really now, to spend with us today. So thank you again, and we will, Madam Clerk, I expect the Chief of Staff is waiting in the wings. All right, we will suspend for 5 minutes and come back with the Chief of Staff. Thank you, Prime Minister. Meeting suspended.
All right, there you have it. Peter Van Dusen watching along with you, listening to the Prime Minister in a fairly extraordinary appearance before the Commons Finance Committee, at times badgered, at times a little bit combative, willing to jump in and state his case, as opposition MPs in particular suggested there's more to this story, and I'm not sure they'll be satisfied with all the answers they got today, but he was there to explain his role in the We Charity controversy and the failed student grant program. It never really got off the ground, and we learned something today that it's not expected to. It sounds like that program now, any student volunteer grant program, the Prime Minister was pretty clear to suggest today, is not going to happen this summer for sure. The Prime Minister insisted no preference was given to the We Charity, even though his wife, mother and brother had received speaking fees and or expenses paid for them when asked to speak at We Charity events. And he told the committee repeatedly he has no idea how much money that we paid to his family members, even though some of that has been in the public domain. What else did we learn today? We learned today that this proposal had been expected to come from We, to come and from public servants, that we be selected as the organization to deliver this grant program, had come before Cabinet on May 8th. Prime Minister only had a couple of hours notice of that and said he in fact pulled it off the agenda. And the way he tells the story, he insisted that more due diligence be done about whether we could and was the only organization that could deliver that program to Canadians across the country, to Canadian young people across the country. So he's telling a story today that he should have recused himself. He acknowledged that again from the discussions around We because of the family connections. But he's telling a story that suggests that he was there as an individual trying to ensure that due diligence was done, basically to answer the question from public servants, are you sure We is the only group that can deliver this? That's what Justin Trudeau was saying today, while opposition members suggested something quite different, that in fact it was the Prime Minister interfering in the process to ensure that the program was delivered by, as they put it, his friends at the We Charity. Let me take you back. We're going to be standing by to hear from Katie Telford, the Chief of Staff. She'll be on the witness, and not so much stand, and it's a virtual committee meeting, but she'll be in the witness chair for a couple of hours when she starts her testimony and gets questioned by members of the Finance Committee. But I think it's important to take you back and let you see it again for yourself if you didn't see it or want to see it again. Exactly how the Prime Minister lays out the series of events that led to the selection of We for this project and how it came apart after that. Here's what Justin Trudeau had to say at the beginning of the committee hearing.
I first learned that We Charity was being proposed to deliver the program on May 8th, when the CSSG was to go before full Cabinet. Until that date, I had not spoken at all with my staff about We Charity in relation to the CSSG. In fact, as of May 8th, my expectation was still that a supercharged version of the Canada Service Corps would likely deliver the program. From my perspective, We Charity hadn't come up. As you know, by May 8th, the public service had already concluded that We Charity was the best option to deliver this program. They had formally recommended it. The CSSG, including the recommendation that We Charity be used, had already gone through the COVID Committee of Cabinet on May 5th. I was not involved in either of those steps. On May 8th, I received a briefing before the Cabinet meeting and learned for the first time that We Charity had been recommended as a partner and was on the Cabinet agenda. I asked why the plan didn't involve the Canada Service Corps. We were told that the Canada Service Corps wouldn't be able to scale up to deliver the program in time. This was disappointing, but ultimately not surprising to me, given my understanding of the state of the Canada Service Corps' development and other demands facing the public service at the time. Of course, policy staff in my office had been working with the Privy Council office and other departments. They knew that We Charity was under consideration. However, I never spoke with my staff about We Charity or its proposed involvement in administering this program until May 8th. I also never spoke to Craig or Mark Kielberger or anyone at We Charity about the CSSG. Did not speak to either of them at all during this period. As it became apparent to me, my Chief of Staff, Katie Telford, also didn't know until the briefing on May 8th that We Charity was being proposed. So my Chief of Staff and I were finding out about this important part of the proposal only hours before the cabinet meeting. Even given the rapid pace of work during the crisis, this was not the way things were supposed to go. We learned that there had been tough questions asked about the CSSG proposal and We Charity during the COVID committee a few days earlier. We both felt that we needed more time before this item was presented to Cabinet, time to consider and understand the reasons behind the proposal that We Charity deliver the program. On that issue, we had several questions that we wanted answered, particularly given my specific expertise in youth issues. During the pandemic, government was working very hard and very quickly.
All right, so Peter Van Dusen, listening to the Prime Minister's opening statement, replaying that for you, and you heard him say that setting out a timeline for exactly how this went down and saying he heard about it for the first time when it came to Cabinet on May 8th, pulled it back to do more due diligence, to have public servants ensure that we was the only group that could deliver it. Now, committee's back with the Chief of Staff, Katie Telford, of the Prime Minister. She's in the chair for 2 hours. Let's listen in.
Time period you're interested in. This pandemic that we are still fighting represents a once-in-a-generation challenge for our country. I started working for the Prime Minister after my mat leave, and what a journey it has been. I ran his leadership campaign in 2012-13 and went on to lead the 2015 campaign, and I've been his Chief of Staff ever since. And unbelievably, my son just turned 9. So some of you may know that I'm a person interested in data. And data has always helped me assess what we are doing well and what we need to do better. And these past few months, every day, we were all waking up to some very alarming statistics. They were more than statistics. Hundreds of people dead because of COVID-19. Hundreds of thousands of people applying for the CERB because they lost their job. Millions of families going through a really tough time. Millions of women in lower wage jobs being especially hurt. Women's participation in our economy is being set back. And every day, daily projections were telling us, and still tell us, that if we weren't and aren't successful in slowing the spread of the virus, things would get much, much worse.
The Prime Minister's work is to help Canadians in need. My work as Chief of Staff is to support him in everything he does. I have worked in the political sphere for quite some time now, and we've had to face challenges that are unprecedented. And it's so gratifying for me to have the opportunity to make a difference in the lives of Canadians. Since the beginning of this crisis, we've announced a myriad of measures to protect the health of Canadians and to help people who've lost their jobs and prepare the recovery of our economy.
We acted as fast as we could, knowing we might make mistakes along the way because people were really struggling. So we needed to move quick. Take the emergency response benefit or the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. We'd already announced these programs when we realized we needed to make them more accessible, more generous, simpler. But job one was get these programs out the door to help people. When we realized that improvements were needed, we made changes. The CERB and the wage subsidy has since helped millions of Canadians right across the country. Back in April, our government announced a $9 billion plan to help young people get through the pandemic. It included measures such as the Canada Emergency Student Benefit, differing student loans, and yes, the Canada Student Summer Grant. I want to go back to the first time we discussed a potential aid package for students. On April 5th, there was a meeting by phone, as they all were at this time, between the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister. It was a stock take on the entirety of our government's ongoing economic response to the pandemic. There were 15 different decision points on the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy that Sunday evening, and it was being announced the next day. That was the focus of the call. We also talked about an orphan well program for Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland to help workers in the energy sector who have been hit especially hard by the crisis. At the end of that conversation, the Finance Minister spoke about gaps he had identified in existing programs like the CERB. We knew that some people were still falling through the cracks. People like seniors, seasonal workers, and yes, students. At the time, the Ministry of Finance was thinking about some form of financial assistance, more Canada summer jobs, and a moratorium on student loan payments. We also talked about using the Canada Service Corps to encourage and support young people who want to volunteer and help their community during this pandemic. That was a very brief part of a larger conversation, and everyone agreed that there was more work to do. Just a few weeks later, after a lot of hard work by many people across the government, the Prime Minister announced a $9 billion aid package for students, which included the items I just listed. The Canada Summer Student Grant Program was 1/10 of that package.
When I think back to the period in question, it was at the end of April, and the Public Service sent us a briefing note about the possibility that we could be calling on an external organization to implement the CSSG. Questions were raised in terms of the government's ability to implement this program, and whether we could directly pay students financial compensation. On April 8th, I learned for the first time, at the same time as the Prime Minister, the proposal from the Minister of Diversity and Youth stating that the We Charity would implement this program. The recommendation from the Public Service was examined and approved by the Cabinet, and we learned about it a few minutes before the Cabinet meeting on April 8th, that we would have to look at this recommendation. As the Prime Minister said in his statement, we both had concerns, and that is why on May 8th, we took the CSSG off the Cabinet meeting agenda. The Minister and myself both had questions. We wanted more information about the efficacy of such a program and using an external organization for this program. And to be quite honest, we were also concerned about people's perceptions. In politics, it's important to look at how students would be perceived, and we searched support from the Public Service, who stated that the We Charity would be the only one that could implement this program, and without a doubt, it would be a good partner for this initiative. When the finance note was approved, the Prime Minister added an additional provision stating that a minister would have to go back to the President of the Treasury Board to seek financing for this project.
This proposal to help students was recommended by the Public Service. This was not a choice between different organizations to deliver the program. This was a choice between going forward with the program or not. I will add that we had previously received the Ethics Commissioner's approval for Sophie Gregoire-Trudeau's work engagement with the We Charity, so I wasn't aware of any conflicts. You have heard the Prime Minister say that he regrets not recusing himself. I have regrets about that too. Obviously, this didn't happen as we intended to, and this is not what we had envisioned, and I share in that responsibility. Over the past few weeks, I have thought a lot about this program. I have thought about what we could do better and how we could apply lessons we've learned going forward. In hindsight, I recognize that while we did ask many questions to make this program a success, we could have done better. We could have done more. We could have added yet another layer of scrutiny to avoid any potential perception of favoritism. Mr. Chair, I work with a team of committed, hardworking individuals. We're not perfect, but we are committed to being better and to doing more. And perhaps most importantly right now, we remain committed to serving and supporting as many Canadians as we can, as quickly as we can. As the daughter of retired public servants, I have the utmost respect not only for public service, but for those who choose it as a career. And I want to take this moment to thank them and my colleagues for the work they continue to do under especially challenging circumstances. I believe that we all get into public service to help others. And what a time for all of us to be doing that. We thought renegotiating NAFTA was a challenge. Well, this pandemic, I am sure, is the challenge of our generation and of my life. To have the chance to take up this work during this time with this team under the leadership of this Prime Minister has been and remains a privilege. With that, I'm pleased to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Telford. The first round of questions I have on my list for the 6-minute round is Mr. Barrett, Ms. Sirowitz, Mr. Fortin, and Mr. Julian. Mr. Barrett, you're on. 6 minutes is yours.
Ma'am, this committee passed a motion calling on the Prime Minister to testify for 3 hours. This meeting is the only one listed in his schedule for today. Frankly, I find it a bit disrespectful to Canadians that he couldn't find a couple extra hours to answer questions. Why couldn't the Prime Minister respect the House of Commons and attend for the full time today?
I don't know whether that's on the topic, but we'll let it go. Ms. Telford.
I believe, Mr. Chair, that the Prime Minister not only accepted the invitation and was pleased to come before the committee, but and originally the invitation was for 1 hour, which he accepted, and then he extended his time and stayed for just over 90 minutes.
Will you schedule him to attend the remaining time requested?
I believe that is perhaps a discussion for another time, Mr. Barrett.
So this is the third time the Prime Minister is under investigation for breaking ethics laws. He's already been found guilty twice of breaking the law. And well, we'll see what's going to happen a third time, though we did hear an admission from the Prime Minister today that he ought to have recused himself. So we know the regard the Prime Minister has for ethics laws. It's been referred to, I recall, as Harper's Law. So why is it that this Prime Minister thinks that he's above the law?
I am going to just to take a moment here, Ms. Telford, the relevance here. And I remind members again, we are here to examine how much the government spent in awarding the $912 million sole source contract to We Charity, and how the outsourcing of the Canada Student Service Grant to We Charity proceeded as far as it did.
Sure.
We'll allow that question. Go ahead, Ms. Telford.
Well, first of all, when you suggest that there was an admission in his remarks and his answers to your many questions earlier, I would just want to correct you in saying that actually it's something he said to Canadians some time ago now. And I believe that the Prime Minister and our entire office and government take ethics extremely strongly. It's a very important thing for us. And it's why we go back and forth with the Ethics Commissioner's office all the time, and we fully cooperate with anything the Ethics Commissioner asks us to look into or to do.
Back to Mr. Barrett.
Well, I mean, he's been found guilty of breaking the act twice. I know that the back and forth goes on often, and that's because he's been under investigation so many times. As his chief, did you read the act after the first time he was found guilty of breaking it?
I've actually read the act before that. But when you say that's, again, you're suggesting that the reason we're going back and forth with the Ethics Commissioner's office was for reasons that, yes, that was the case, but we also go back and forth with the Ethics Commissioner's office all the time, whether it's annual disclosures or questions, because we want to make sure we're getting the interpretations that do also change over time that we interpret things as accurately as possible, as often as possible.
Mr. Barrett.
After March 1st, how many times did the PMO communicate with the Kielburgers or any of their intermediaries?
So there were, I looked into this, and there were a handful of interactions with the Prime Minister's office and the We organization around the Canada Summer Student Grant between then and the launch of the program. There was only one in prior to the launch period of the program. It was in early May, where one of the policy staff did what is very, very normal in their job, which is to speak to stakeholder organizations. And it was a very general discussion, and they actually redirected the stakeholder, the We organization, to ESDC officials, which was the more appropriate place to be able to get answers for the questions they were asking.
We'll let it come back to Mr. Barrett. And I didn't outline at the beginning, Ms. Telford, that we are under what we call the COVID-19 rules. We try and keep the answers as tight to the questions as we can, or I try to, and sometimes I succeed. Mr. Barrett, I won't take that time from you. Go ahead.
And what day did that interaction occur, ma'am?
I believe it was on May 5th.
Okay. And are you able to tell us which policy staffer made that inquiry?
I was a member of the policy team.
Okay. So the Prime Minister claims today that his staff were working on the program before May 8th. Can you provide this committee a list of everyone that was involved? Can you furnish the committee in writing with everyone that was involved in the decision?
It's public information who all the staff in the Prime Minister's office are, and I'm here to represent all of those staff as the senior-most member of the Prime Minister's office. So if you have questions about any of them or for any of them, I'm happy to take them today.
Okay, well, the Prime Minister testified today that the option given to the cabinet was we or nothing, and which was ultimately the outcome was nothing. And why did the cabinet accept this supposed binary choice? Why not ask for options? You know, is this a government run by the public service, or is it run by cabinet? Because the accountability rests with the head of government. It rests with the cabinet. So I'm getting pretty frustrated hearing, you know, how much respect that the members of cabinet have for the public service while throwing them under the bus instead of taking accountability for their decisions. So why wouldn't they have required options?
So I want to just address two things you said there. One is not trying to, no one is throwing anyone under the bus here. I'm explaining, and I'm happy to explain what happened. And we relied on the public service and their recommendations, and their recommendation was to proceed. And the question you're asking around, you know, you being frustrated, it was a binary choice, that was exactly the kind of question that the Prime Minister and I were asking on May 8th, which caused it to be pulled from the cabinet agenda that morning so that we could confirm that that was truly the case.
Last question, Mr. Barrett.
Since from March 1st until now, when did you speak with the Prime Minister about the We organization?
On May 8th was when we first learned that the We organization was being proposed as the organization to deliver and administer this program, and so that is when we spoke about it.
Thank you both. We'll turn now to Ms. Zerowitz for 6 minutes, followed by Mr. Fortin. Ms. Zerowitz.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Telford, for joining us today. We really are grateful. You know, it's we always remember to thank our ministers, our Prime Minister, our bureaucrats, but we often forget the amazing team of people that sit in the Prime Minister's office. So I want to say a huge thanks to you and to the amazing team there. I can only imagine how crazy the last few months have been, so thank you for your extraordinary effort. My first question is, you rightly talked about how we've gone through an unprecedented time and the impact to Canadians has been extraordinary. You know, we have asked our politicians, our civil servants, our staff to work at an extraordinary pace to deliver over 70 emergency programs at a spend of over $200 billion. And this is just a general question. Were there any additional processes put in place or any special oversight mechanisms because of the increased level of spending and the speed of the decision making?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that's actually one of the things I've been reflecting on, and the team has been reflecting on in this last period of time, is whether there is additional rigor that could be put in place even in a time of crisis. Our focus, for the reasons you said and the reasons I said in my opening statement, has been on getting support to Canadians as quickly as we can and to as many as we can. And that does not mean, and that is why we also held up the proposal on May 8th, that rigor does not need to be applied. And we know that rigor has been being applied by the public service throughout, by staff and ministers' offices and ministers throughout. But obviously things have moved in compressed time periods, and thus, you know, the time isn't necessarily spent in the same ways as in the past. And we need to think about how to ensure we continue to have rigor as you would in a normal time, in a time of crisis as well.
Thank you for that. My next question is, there's a lot of questions that come up at our committee around the change in the We board, the layoffs that took place, whether or not we had registered themselves as a lobbyist or not. And we have heard that the bureaucrats have, that we have a lot of confidence that our bureaucrats have done their due diligence. My question to you is just, I just want to make sure that Canadians understand that there is, what's the responsibility of the bureaucrats versus what actually comes to cabinet. If you could just maybe elaborate on that, I'd be grateful. And I think just one more point I want to make, just because I think there was a little bit of misinformation. we did receive from Rachel Warnick that there were 8 organizations that were actually assessed by ESDC officials to potentially deliver CSSG. And we also heard that ESDC officials held 2 calls with Canada Service Corps to see whether or not they could actually, to discuss this particular program. But anyways, if you could just maybe talk so that people can understand that division.
So in terms of, I think obviously the department that is presenting the memorandum to Cabinet, along with departments that work, because many different departments, especially in this time, everyone was rolling up their sleeves and working on a number of different projects at once, and supporting different departments were supporting each other with their work in truly unprecedented ways. What ultimately comes to Cabinet is a memorandum to Cabinet that summarizes those recommendations, summarizes the due diligence that has been done. And it was there that we saw that the recommendation that said that there is this one organization that is able to deliver this program. I think one of the differences is there are all kinds of briefing notes that go back and forth between departments on all kinds of details within it, that we're looking at some of those assessments that you describe, and that I believe you've had officials, I know you've had officials who have come to committee and described them. And there's all kinds of work done between ministers' offices and departments leading up to that memorandum of Cabinet that then summarizes the information they've put together and makes a recommendation to Cabinet.
Thank you. My next question is, I know that there was a lot of anxiousness to ensure that the programs for youth were accelerated as fast as possible. Can you describe to us what is your understanding of what was behind the Prime Minister's motivation to deliver the program as fast as possible? And that was the CSSG program, as well as all the other student programs that were introduced.
Look, going back to the April 5th conversation that I referenced, and it was a relatively brief conversation, but it does kind of, I think, summarize an answer to what you're asking. We talked about the fact that there were gaps in our existing programs, and that there were certain populations, key parts of our population, that weren't yet getting the support that they needed. As I mentioned, we've talked about seniors, we've talked about seasonal workers. And we talked about, in that case, students. And when it came to students, we talked about students first and foremost. Job one was, how do we help those students who all of a sudden found themselves heading into summer, because not only was there a pandemic, it was the end of their school year, or it was about to be soon. And so how do we help those students who had rent to pay, who needed to put groceries on the table? And then our second objective, but a very important one, was we were starting to already see research and stories being told, and people telling us directly about the impact. And I know I heard some members talking about this in the committee with the Prime Minister earlier as well, that you all recognize, because you hear it from your constituents, I know, of the concerns around mental health for young people, the concern about wanting to make sure that we don't have a lost generation here, where they have to spend years catching up from this period of time. And so we wanted to see what ways we could ensure that we were connecting young people to their communities and encouraging people to be innovative in that regard. And this has been something the Prime Minister's talked about for a long time as well.
We're going to have to move on here, Ms. Telford. Turning then to Mr. Fortin for 6 minutes. Riel.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. Ms. Telford, the Prime Minister has already been caught twice breaking ethics regulations, in case with the AGACON and also with SNC Lavalin, and there were other adventures. In terms of We Charity, the Prime Minister said he delayed the decision about this because he wasn't comfortable, and you confirmed this. How can you explain that he's once again been caught with his hand in the cookie jar after all these previous red flags?
Mr. Chair, I have to reject what the member is saying in terms of what happened here, other than your opening comments, sir, which were that the Prime Minister did have concerns at the May 8th meeting when he was first briefed on this, and he said he wanted to get more by way of briefing, and that's what he did.
And after receiving new information, he was reassured. He didn't think there was any conflict of interest yet. Seems to be the case. How can you explain this?
We were reassured that this program was the only way that this program could happen this summer in this unprecedented time was for the WE organization to administer it and deliver it. And that was the reassurance we were given. There was, and at that point, it was determined to proceed.
Yet, the president of the public service said that they could have administered it. Did you not believe them?
I'm sorry. What?
Ms. Telford, I believe Mr. Fortin, and might not have come through in translation. It was the president of the Public Service Alliance, I believe, was it not, Riel, that said they could deliver it. That was the question. The president of the Public Service Alliance indicated they could that the public service could deliver it. Why not?
So what we were briefed at the time, and actually on more than one occasion at that time during that period, was and it was based on other experiences at the time, was that this was the only way the program could be delivered for this summer.
But Mr. Trudeau knew there was a conflict of interest on May 8th, and he said he didn't want to make a decision right away because he was uncomfortable. You knew this, that he had already been caught twice infringing the Ethics Act, and yet you moved ahead even though that the mother and the brother of the Mr. Trudeau had been paid by We Charity. And the last time Mr. Trudeau said he would never get caught again. And what mechanism did you set up so that we have the same issue today? Did no one learn from previous misadventures?
Ms. Telford.
So there's a lot in there. I'll start with the fact of what we knew at that time and when we were making the decision. And what I knew at that time, and the Prime Minister has spoken to, is the fact that the Prime Minister has gone on the stage for some We Day events. He was never paid for speaking at those events. They were youth empowerment events that he'd gone to as someone passionate about empowering youth, but also as the youth critic and later the youth minister in the first mandate. And I also knew that the ethics commissioner, as I said in my opening remarks, that the ethics commissioner we had sought advice from as it related to Sophie Gregoire-Trudeau's role with the We Charity organization, and received clearance that she could both take that role on and have her expenses covered by the organization.
We will have to go back to Mr. Fortin.
Madame Telford.
Ms. Telford, as the Prime Minister's advisor and Chief of Staff, did you not already tell Mr. Trudeau that he should not get involved in this decision?
As I said already, what we discussed at the time and what we knew at the time was that this was a binary choice, as one of the other members said earlier. It was a choice on whether to proceed with this program to support students this summer in this way of connecting them to their communities or not. And the Prime Minister, there was no conflict discussed at that time.
Votre recommandation à vous, c'était
what was your recommendation to Mr. Trudeau? Did you recommend he proceed despite the appearance of a conflict of interest?
So first of all, again, as I said in my opening remarks, and as the Prime Minister referred to, and I believe the Clerk of the Privy Council made reference to as well, I did have questions on May 8th and had some concerns. I had concerns in terms of ensuring that that this was the right organization in order to do this, that it was truly the only organization that could do this, that all of the T's had been crossed and I's had been dotted. And yes, as I said in my opening remarks, I had some concerns around perception, knowing that it had just been recently that Sophie Gregoire-Trudeau's podcast had been launched. But I also knew that the Ethics Commissioner had cleared that. And so on that basis, we decided to proceed.
We'll
and
let
I
it go
support
back.
the Prime Minister in that.
We'll let it go back to Mr. Fortin. The last question, Mr. Fortin.
Vous êtes en train de nous dire, Madame
You're telling us, Ms. Telford, that the Ethics Commissioner told Mr. Trudeau he could proceed with this, and he decided to participate in the decision-making process in spite of the perception of a conflict of interest?
Ms. Telford.
What I said was, and I said also in my opening remarks, is that we had clearance from the Ethics Commissioner for Sophie Gregoire-Trudeau to have the to do the work that she was doing with the We organization.
Mr. Fortin, we're out of time on that round.
Monsieur le Président, question.
Chair, point of privilege, point of order. Because I'm asking witnesses in French questions, I'm losing roughly 20 to 30% of my time because of the delay in interpretation. And sometimes the answers don't relate to my questions. And obviously the witnesses is not understanding what I'm saying. And yourself, Chair, you did a correct translation, but you had to translate one of my questions to the witness. And in terms of other parties, I've had much less time than the Liberals to ask questions, and they're just asking for advertising, whereas I'm asking real questions. And I would like the same speaking time as the Conservatives. I'd like to be able to do my job correctly. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Fortin, and I actually do believe you have a legitimate concern. I am always, when you're asking questions, I am having a hard job keeping up because I have to wait for translation too. We'll have to deal with that at a committee level sometime, but I think it is a concern. Mr. Julian, 6-minute round, who will be followed by Mr. Cooper. Mr. Julian.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Ms. Telford, for being here today. We appreciate you being available for the full 2 hours. You mentioned, I'll have a couple quick questions to start. You mentioned earlier fully cooperating with the Ethics Commissioner. Now, we'll recall, of course, the previous scandal, the SNC-Lavalin scandal. The Ethics Commissioner said 11 months ago that he was, quote, unable to fully discharge the investigatory duties conferred upon me, because he wasn't getting the documentation from the PMO and the PCO. Can you state that you're willing to cooperate both with the Ethics Commissioner and also with this committee and provide all the documentation, including the recommendations that went forward on May 8th and May 22nd, all documentation concerning the WE program?
Ms. Telford.
I'm, of course, and I've always been happy to coordinate with the Ethics Committee, to cooperate with the Ethics Commissioner, and will continue to do so. And in terms of documents, I would have to look into, I'm not sure what documents you're looking for, but I'm happy to look into any specific requests.
The specific request is for the memos that were going to Cabinet on May 8th and went to Cabinet on May 22nd. Those are very specific requests, and the PCO has already indicated that they will be providing that to us, and we would appreciate having the cooperation of the PMO. Second quick question. We know that you've had a past background with both WE and its predecessor organization. Have you or any member of your family, either directly or indirectly through Artbound, ever received expense reimbursement, free travel, financial payments, use of WE staff time?
No.
Thank you. Now, my third question is around Mr. Morneau's deep connections with WE. Were you aware of Mr. Morneau's connections and his family connections with the WE organizations?
The only connection that I was that only really came back to me recently was the fact that, as the Prime Minister mentioned, his daughter had written a book that when I saw the cover shown recently, it had, or I'm not sure if it was the front or the back, but it did have a quote from a Kielburger on it, and that was really the extent of my knowledge of the connections.
Were you aware of the private travel that was not reimbursed, the use of private aircraft? Were you aware of any of those cases with Mr. Morneau?
Not until recently.
Were you aware that we use their staff on staff time and we basically provide them with expense reimbursements to help fill seats and act as backdrops at Mr. Morneau's events?
No.
Given those direct benefits, would you agree that Mr. Morneau was clearly in a conflict of interest around this WE proposal?
Minister Morneau has already said that he apologized and said that he wished he'd recused himself from this cabinet decision, and I obviously support that.
So if you believe he was in a conflict of interest, would that not apply to Mr. Trudeau as well?
The Prime Minister also said, and it was out of concern for perception, he's also recently said that he wished he'd recused himself from this, and I support that as well.
But you would agree that they were both in a conflict of interest, in other words, had contravened the Conflict of Interest Act?
No, I think that is, no. What both of them said is that, and what the Prime Minister said specifically, is that he wished he'd recused himself from this particular decision at Cabinet so that there weren't any concerns around perception of favoritism.
So you see it as a perception, not as a violation of the Conflict of Interest Act. Okay, thank you for that. Now, moving on to the actual decision, were you involved, or was the Prime Minister's office involved in any way in the decision not to adequately fund Canada's summer jobs program for students? As you are aware, and as MPs across the country are aware, it was basically a program that was shortchanged, and right across the country, positions were not filled because of the inadequate funding that was provided to Canada's summer jobs. Was that a decision that you were aware of or that you took part of?
I do believe that differs from the issue we're discussing today, Peter, but I will go ahead, Ms. Telford, if you have an answer.
It's very relevant, Mr. Chair, very relevant.
I know how important the Canada Summer Jobs Program is both to students and to all of the honourable members in the House of Commons. We hear about it from caucus members on a regular basis, how important it is in their ridings. And I was pleased to hear recently that there's over 85,000 jobs that have been approved through the Canada Summer Jobs Program this summer.
Well, my question was actually, were you involved in that decision, or who took that decision? But I'll move on. I will quote from you from the Public Service Alliance of Canada's national president, Chris Alward, who appeared before this committee. He said, and I quote, Mr. Trudeau's claim that We Charity is the only one that can administer the new grant program is not only factually wrong, it's also insulting to our members. And that means both in terms of the Prime Minister's testimony and yours, that factually you are giving information that is simply incorrect. To what extent was the public service actually involved in this decision when clearly public servants wanted to be involved in the program, were ready to be involved in the program, and don't appear to have been considered at any point in the elaboration of this scheme?
So we can go based on the information that was recommended to us at the time by public servants. And public servants themselves said that this was a program at this time that was best administered by a third-party organization.
I just quoted a public servant that said the contrary.
Mr. Julian, I took a little time from you talking there, so I'll give you one more question.
The public servants have indicated that they could administer the new grant program. My question to you is, and it comes back to the Canada Summer Jobs underfunding as well, who made these decisions? Were they passed on to you? Were you aware in the Prime Minister's office, or did the Prime Minister's office participate in these decisions that had such wide-reaching consequences?
Look, it's my job to give the best advice I can based on the best information I can to the Prime Minister on all of the decisions that are coming before him and before the Cabinet. So to the extent that any of the various student and youth programs were coming to Cabinet, then I was giving advice to the Prime Minister on those programs.
Okay, thank you both. We'll now go to a 5-minute round. First up will be Mr. Cooper, Mr. Fraser, Mr. Cumming, and Ms. Katrakis. Mr. Cooper, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, Ms. Telford, for being here today. You said, and the Prime Minister said, that the Ethics Commissioner gave a clearance with respect to the activities of Ms. Gregoire Trudeau with respect to we. And the Prime Minister said that clearance had taken place a long time ago. Would you not see that there might be a need to talk to the Ethics Commissioner on May 8th in the face of a $500 million contribution that the Prime Minister would be involved in discussing and ultimately deciding at the cabinet table?
Ms. Telford.
So when clearance was sought for the work that Sophie Gregoire Trudeau has been doing to work on destigmatizing mental health and empowering young people, the ethics commissioner actually explicitly stated that she was asked to be doing this in her own right, not as wife of the Prime Minister, and that her expenses could be covered as part of that work. So we had the clearance for her to do the thing she was doing, and it actually also explicitly stated that it did not put us into any position of conflict.
Ms. Telford, that was in the abstract. Now you had before you a $500 million contribution that was being discussed and decided upon at cabinet. Did you advise the Prime Minister that he ought to consult the Ethics Commissioner? And if not, why not? And why didn't he? Because obviously it's proven, as it turns out, to be of some interest to the Ethics Commissioner.
Ms. Telford.
I don't believe it was entirely in the abstract. We had a very complete description of what Sophie's work was going to be and the kind of and the scope of it. And that's what had actually just recently launched. The podcast was part of that scope. It also included a clearance for her to be able to do travel for some of her speaking engagements with the organization.
You said, and the Prime Minister said, you were concerned about people's perceptions. I submit that I take it that would be perceptions of conflict of interest. I would submit actual conflicts of interest. So it's inexplicable why you or would not have advised him or why he would not have taken it upon himself to go to the Ethics Commissioner. But I want to ask you about May 8th and what you said and what he said, namely that he pushed back when he learned about the proposal and had questions. If, in fact, the Prime Minister pushed back, then how do you explain that the We organization was collecting eligible expenses as of May 5th?
Ms. Telford.
I think that is a question that is, and I'm sure you did, but it's a question best placed to the officials who made the arrangements with the We organization. I believe you asked those questions of the We organization as well, in terms of the specifics within the contribution agreement. But you suggested that it was perhaps, you said if he pushed back. I can assure you he actually did push back with a number of questions in that briefing, and it's why it didn't go to cabinet that day.
Well, but for 2 weeks, between May 8th and May 22nd, we continued to incur eligible expenses. So it just doesn't add up to say the Prime Minister pushed back, but it wasn't frozen. The message wasn't conveyed to we, and they continued to proceed with moving ahead as though they were about to administer the program. How do you explain that?
Again, I would encourage you to ask those questions if you haven't already, though I'm sure you did, of the We organization and of the officials involved in the crafting of the contribution agreement.
Well, clearly the message didn't get very far if the Prime Minister, in fact, pushed back.
The program was launched, as you know, at the end of June, and it was only at that time that the agreement, or just prior to then, obviously, that the agreement was finalized. How they structured the details within the agreement, that I cannot speak to.
Well, they continue to incur expenses as the Prime Minister supposedly pushed back. But I want to ask you, Mr. Julian had raised the issue of Artbound, and I want to pick up a little bit on that. and ask more broadly, what is the total value of expenses, benefits, reimbursements, or any other in-kind or monetary consideration that you have received from the We organization or any organization affiliated with Kielburgers?
Nothing.
And that would include with respect to your travel with Craig and Mark Kielburger to Kenya in February of 2011?
I did not travel anywhere.
You did not travel anywhere in February of 2011? Well, I happened to have pulled up an article profiling Jason Denny, in which it notes that in February of 2011, that he, along with Seamus O'Regan, Craig and Mark Kielburger, Amanda Alvaro, and Katie Telford, among many extraordinary others, traveled to a region of Kenya to build an art school. You know nothing about that trip?
I'm familiar with how they went on that trip. I was not on that trip.
Okay.
Okay, we'll have to end it there, Mr. Cooper, and we'll go to Mr. Fraser, followed by Mr. Cumming.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Telford, for being with us today. I want to just prod into the May 8th meeting a little bit, where there was pushback and concerns raised. In response to Mr. Barrett's question earlier, you indicated the kinds of things that were pushed back on was the binary choice that was presented by the public service. I'm curious, did you actually push back, you or the Prime Minister push back on the idea that it had to be a binary choice? Did you ask that they consider other organizations?
Yes, those were the types of questions we were interested in, and as the committee has heard, I believe, from some of the preceding witnesses, that they had considered and assessed a number of other partners, but that was the kind of thing exactly that we wanted to know.
And nevertheless, they remained confident that the choice was binary. We go ahead with We Charity, or the program doesn't happen. Is that fair?
That's right.
Okay. Did you or anybody else at PMO ever ask We Charity to administer the Canada Student Service Grant Program?
No.
There was a evidence tendered in before this committee previously. There was some other unsolicited proposal for a youth entrepreneurship strategy. Did you or anybody at PMO ever have conversations with the Kielburgers or others at We Charity about that program?
I don't believe so.
Did you, frankly, did you ever speak with the Kielburgers personally since, I don't know, we'll pick a date back around the beginning of say the 1st of March, before the pandemic began?
I'm pretty sure, because I have been racking my brain on this, I'm pretty sure the last time I saw Mark Kielburger was at an event of hundreds of people in Toronto, where I met his wife and exchanged pleasantries. It was a Toronto Life event or something of that kind in December of 2017.
Did you or anybody else in the Prime Minister's office have any role in actually negotiating the contribution agreement?
No.
So all of the details around which entity was being paid would have been done through the public service, not through political office?
Yes, there were, in terms of which, yes. On the specific, I would just say more broadly that policy staff between different offices were ensuring certain objectives were being met through the contribution agreement. But the negotiation absolutely was not happening through political staff at all.
Thank you, and I appreciate that clarification as well. I'm curious, as a local MP, I get unsolicited proposals all the time for projects, usually in my own riding. Is this something that you find comes up with perhaps organizations that are bigger than the ones in my backyard that actually pitch unsolicited proposals to the Prime Minister's office for policy ideas or programs?
That does happen. It did not happen in this case that I received any unsolicited proposal directly, but that absolutely does happen from all kinds of organizations. Staff in the Prime Minister's office, it's something I encourage, is for them to be talking to stakeholders and staying connected to the ground, talking to MPs of all parties when they have something that they want to pitch that they believe that the government should be doing that allows us to serve Canadians better.
And in fact, I think the reason I ask is there was sort of an innuendo through the course of this committee hearing that it was somehow inappropriate that an organization would have had an inside track to make unsolicited proposals. But in fact, I agree with you. I think it's actually a positive thing. In fact, those kinds of pitches have led to projects going ahead in my own community from nonprofits routinely, frankly, that don't know the best way to turn. And I'm curious, have you actually seen any positive programs implemented as a result of those kinds of unsolicited proposals? I hate to put you on the spot. If there's not one front of mind, I'll let you skate on this one.
I'm sure there have been. I can think of a number of examples of women's organizations and who have contacted me over time, in particular, who felt they had an open door with me to try to see if they could have more of a role working with the federal government to promote women in all kinds of different sectors. I can't think of a specific example off the top of my head, but there certainly have been some.
Sure. One of the things that I'm curious about, I was a little bit involved through the finance team's efforts to take feedback from stakeholders all across Canada on some of the emergency measures that our government's put forward in response to COVID-19. Frankly, the Canada Student Service Grant is not something that I was engaged with consultation processes on. But from your perspective, how much time did this eat up in comparison to the other programs? I'm thinking about CERB, the wage subsidy, the rental assistance, the program to support women's programs, programs to support charities, etc. I don't want to just rhyme off a list of dozens of programs here. But what was the time breakdown? Was this a major time suck in terms of the policy development, or how does it compare to the other programs?
That'll have to be the last question, Sean. Ms. Telford.
Well, I can't speak for everyone involved in this, because I'm sure it took a lot of work by a lot of the both policy staff in different offices and, of course, the officials who worked on this program. Though I do know that many of those same people were working on more than one program and issue to support Canadians at a time. And as you've heard in terms of the Prime Minister, I think probably in normal circumstances, there would have been some greater lengths of time, even just between cabinet committee and briefings from one to the next. And that is what has made this time so unprecedented, is that things are moving from, one, as I said, on the Canada wage subsidy, there were 15 decision points on April 5th for a wage subsidy that was, I think, desperately needed by Canadians and Canadian businesses, and it was being announced the next day. That's how quickly things have been moving.
Okay, thank you both. Turning to Mr. Cumming, followed by Ms. Kotrakis. We've 5 minutes. James?
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Telford, for being here today. On which date since March 1st did you communicate with Minister Morneau or his staff about we?
I don't know if you mean ahead of the cabinet meeting. I don't believe on any dates.
And you'd mentioned, you had suggested before that you're aware of the Morneau's connection with the daughter with the book, but I just want to clarify, you were unaware of any travel that Minister Morneau might have taken, or the family travel?
That's right.
But given what we know now with the Morneau's direct involvement in this project and his failure to recuse himself and this illegally sponsored paid travel from the organization in question, do you think the minister should step down?
I think some of the things you're saying have not been determined at all. And I believe the Minister of Finance has already said that he wished he had recused himself. He's apologized for that and does not believe there is a conflict beyond that. But that is for the Conflict Commissioner to spend time on, and everyone has agreed to cooperate fully.
When did you become aware of WE's April 9th proposal?
April 9th proposal. So this is the Canada Summer Student Grant proposal. Is that
No,
right?
that was their initial proposal about social entrepreneurship.
Right. So it was in a very large briefing package that we received on April 20th ahead of an April 21st briefing. It was actually Annex 9 of that package when I looked back to get some of these things straight for all of you. And actually, that annex ultimately was never followed through on and was turned down in terms of that proposal.
And what was contained in that large briefing package? What were the specifics that were in it?
It was so large because that was the package that led to the $9 billion announcement by this government to support students. So that included everything that was in that. It was, and that was again being briefed on the 20th for an announcement that was coming within hours, let alone days.
So related to that April 9th proposal, did anyone in the PMO communicate with Ministers Morneau, Chagger, or Ng about that proposal?
I'm sure that policy staff, as they do on every issue that is coming up within the government, we're talking to each other between ministers' offices.
Can you provide the staff members that were communicating regarding that proposal?
Can I provide? I'm here on their behalf, so I'm happy to take a question on it if you'd like.
So you wouldn't know what level of communication there was regarding that proposal between those ministers' offices. Was it one person? Was it lots of chatter, or what was the extent of the discussions with the other ministers' offices?
Look, that was a proposal that ultimately is not one that this government proceeded with, and that the Prime Minister's office did not approve. So there was obviously analysis done to that extent. And there would have been conversations between the different ministers' office to come to that determination.
The issue there, though, is that they submitted a proposal, and then lo and behold, we submit another proposal. So was there any instructions back to those departments or to we to come back with a modified proposal?
The way in which the first proposal came through in terms of a briefing note that I saw, it was actually recommending from our policy team to not proceed with that proposal. That was the total sum of the advice on that proposal, was that we not proceed on it.
Last question, Mr. Cumming.
So when was the first time that you communicated with Minister Ng about we or the Kilburgers since March 1st?
I don't believe we have communicated about we or the Kilburgers in that time period at all.
Okay, you got time for one more, James? That was a quick question, a quick answer. Go ahead.
So you don't believe, or you don't know whether you or your staff or anyone in the department had any kind of discussions with Mary Ng about we since March?
Oh, I thought your previous question was about me. So I personally did not have a conversation with Minister Ng about that proposal. I would have to, I'm unaware of staff having spoken directly to her, though I suspect they did speak, as I already said, that they would have been speaking with her office on that proposal.
Okay, thank you both. We'll now turn to Ms. Koutrakis and then on to Ms. Goodrow and Mr. Julian. Ms. Koutrakis.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Telford, for being here with us this afternoon. We, Charity, sent their social entrepreneurial proposal in April 2020. Were you aware of that proposal at the time?
So are we talking about, I just want to make sure I'm talking about the right, are we talking about the social entrepreneurial proposal?
Exactement.
Okay. Merci. So I was not aware when it first came into the Prime Minister's office. As I said, there was advice that came through from our policy team, and just to provide a little more on that. The reason that, one of the reasons in terms of not proceeding with that proposal was actually it seemed like it might be a better program fit from a recovery standpoint, perhaps, but it wasn't the right thing at this time. Right now, we are focused on emergency measures and we needed emergency measures to support students. And that was the phase we were in from April, and we continue to be in.
Et compte tenu de l'importance,
and given the importance and the scope of the CSSG and of the rapidity with which the program was elaborated and implemented, the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance, could they have fully recused themselves from this decision-making process? And could this have had a significant impact in terms of the time or the quality of the CSSG if the Prime Minister had recused himself fully from this decision?
So both the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance have said that they wish that they had recused themselves. It's hard to speak in terms of what might be the case, but I don't believe, because the program was being offered as a binary choice, it was whether to proceed or not proceed, that the program would have been any different if they had been there. But there was, I think in retrospect, they have both said, given the potential for concern around a perception of favoritism, that was reason alone for them to have recused themselves.
And can you please describe how a program of similar size and scope as the CSSG would be designed, outsourced, and administered under normal circumstances? Can you compare that process to the process used to determine how this program would be outsourced and implemented given the current crisis situation we are facing?
So I'm not sure that it would be any different if we were in a non-crisis time or a non-pandemic crisis time, except for one very big factor, which is obviously that things were moving very, very quickly, and the volume of work that was being done. We had people working from their homes, obviously, and everyone was separate from each other and having to work right around the clock. I mean, it was 15 to 20-hour days, 7 days a week. So those were some not insignificant differences that don't explain anything other than to say, I think those were the true differences between now and perhaps a normal time. I would also just add that there have been, both during this time and in the past, but several examples during this time as well, where, and I believe the Prime Minister may have referenced these, at least one of them, that there have been many other examples of using third-party organizations, working and partnering with third-party organizations to be able to help deliver programs during this time.
And my final question, Mr. Chair, if I may. Can you expand, Ms. Telford, on the lessons learned throughout this process and comment on how these lessons will be applied going forward to avoid similar confusions or perceptions of conflict of interest? What more can we put in place in all cabinet members and especially for the PM?
So I think, as I said in one of my earlier answers, a reflection that we've had is knowing that this crisis is ongoing, is how even within a crisis we ensure that we are adding layers of protection, adding rigor to the process, and not even if it means slowing down slightly, despite the fact that we still need to move very, very quickly to support Canadians and need to continue doing that. And finding that right balance. This has obviously given us a pause to make sure that we keep improving.
Okay, thank you both. Ms. Goudreau, we're down to a 2.5 minute round or 3. Go ahead.
Hello, Chair. I omitted to tell you that for the rest of this sitting, I will be giving my time to my colleague, Mr. Fortin.
I'll not take that time from ideas. Mr. Fortin, you're on. My apologies.
Merci, c'est gentil, monsieur.
Thank you very much. Very kind of you, Chair. I'd like to start first by apologizing earlier. I said that the translation service caused me enormous prejudice because I would be losing time, but this was not a criticism of the translators themselves. I wanted to say that. Ms. Telford, you said if you had to do things again, there could be protection mechanisms that could be improved. And that's surprising because we know that this is the third time the Prime Minister has been caught. How come that this mechanism was not already in place, given the Aga Khan misadventure?
As I said in my opening remarks, and I think I've said in a couple of answers already, I think we always need to be working to improve and to find different ways to make sure that we are being as careful and cognizant as possible, even of just the perception of any favoritism or conflict or anything else. And I think we've been reflecting on that, and we are going to keep working hard to improve, and we will be working with the Ethics Commissioner and taking any advice that they have as well.
On est d'accord avec ça, c'est certain, madame.
Of course, we agree with that, Ms. Telford, but what I don't understand is how come it wasn't already done. Nevertheless, Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Morneau both apologized for not recusing themselves from the decision, and they regretted not doing so. What is your opinion? Do you agree with them that they should have recused themselves at that time?
Of course, I supported both of them in terms of their statements to Canadians.
Donc, vous êtes d'accord avec le fait qu'ils auraient dû ne pas participer?
So you agree with the fact that they should not have participated in the decision-making process to give this agreement to We Charity?
I think they've both said that in hindsight, and upon reflection, that they both wish that they had recused themselves.
Oui,
And that I agree with.
Mais la question, c'est vous.
But the question is about you. Do you agree with this, that they should not have sat in on that decision?
I think I'm answering your question, sir. I support both the minister and the prime minister in what they said.
OK.
Last question, Mr. Fortin.
Et Madame Telford, si vous êtes d'accord.
Ms. Telford, if you agree today that they should not have sat in on that decision, and they both agree that they should not have done so, how do you explain that between May 8th, when there was a flag raised, and how come between May 8th and when the decision was made, that everyone said to Gay, they're going to move forward with this, and now you say that they're saying that they should not have? How do you explain that change?
I think at the time, and I would just take you back to what we talked about in terms of what we were aware of at the time. The Prime Minister has, actually when he became leader of the Liberal Party, he disclosed all of his financials and proactively disclosed all of his previous paid speaking engagements in a way that I'm not sure that any political leaders have done in the past. And it's something we'd been very, very transparent about. I knew that he had never been paid to speak for any We Day or We functions. I similarly knew that all of Sophie Grégoire-Trudeau's work, and since the Prime Minister, since we were in government, that none of that had ever been paid, and that we actually had clearance from the Ethics Commissioner for the role that she had taken on. And so there wasn't discussion of conflict at that time.
Okay, then we'll go on to Mr. Julian, 2.5, 3 minutes, Peter, and following Mr. Julian will be Mr. Morant. Mr. Julian.
Thank you. I am interested in going into the due diligence that Mr. Trudeau alluded to in his testimony between May 8th and May 22nd. We've already determined that the public service was perfectly willing and able to assume the program. So there's no longer this binary choice that seems to have been part of testimony to justify it. But I'm interested in the issue of liability. During that 2-week period, was there investigation, and were you aware that the contract would actually be signed with the We Charity Foundation, which is basically a shell foundation with no assets? And that would increase liability challenges, of course, for the students if they were involved with the program, but also to the federal government. Were you aware of that, and what due diligence was done around that?
I was not aware of the We Charity, We Foundation distinction at the time. That would be something that would be left to, and is wise, I believe, for political staff to be leaving to the public servants, is to sort out the details of how a contract and how a contribution agreement should flow.
Okay, so there's no discussion of that. The Code of Ethics governs teachers, and I'll mention BCTF. Of course, as you know, the Prime Minister was briefly a teacher. two sections of the Code of Ethics include number 2, the member teacher must respect the confidential nature of information concerning students and may give it only to authorized persons or agencies directly concerned with their welfare. And section 3, that a privileged relationship exists between teachers and students. And in other words, the teacher must refrain from exploiting that relationship for material advantage. Now, of course, in the WE scheme, there was a $12,000 payment to teachers that I think quite clearly violates those two components of the Code of Ethics for British Columbia and would right across the country. To what extent was due diligence performed to ensure that the scheme itself actually met codes of ethics for teachers across the country, who of course maintain the highest possible standards?
I've actually, in my career, done a lot of work with teachers' organizations and teachers' associations as well. And but I can't say I was not involved in sorting out this part of the agreement.
So Ms. Telford, who was in the room? Who was making these decisions for this proposal? Who was in the room? Are you aware of the people that made this decision? Because the public service obviously says that they could have done it. All of this mess has blossomed forward and no one seems to be wanting to take responsibility for it. Who was in the room?
I think you've actually spoken to quite a number of the people who are in the room, Mr. Julian. I think you've spoken to some of the senior-most officials, and you've spoken to the Minister of Diversity, Inclusion and Youth. So I'm not sure how you're confused on that. What?
I'm not confused. I'd just like to know, are you aware of who was in the room developing the scheme, and can you provide those names to us?
Ms. Telford?
I would have to look into that with the clerk of the Privy Council, but I believe that you've actually already spoken to all of the key people who would actually be able to answer that exact question for you.
Okay, thank you all. And now we'll turn to, I have Mr. Morantz on my list. Is he next to Mr. Polyev? Oh. Okay, Mr. Polyev will be followed by Mr. McLeod. You have 5 minutes, Mr. Polyev.
The WE charity says that it had authorization to begin implementing the program on May 5th. Did anyone in the PMO speak to the organization on May 5th? Yes or no?
Yes, I already stated that.
Who?
I'm here on behalf of my staff.
Who?
And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have for them. Is there a question you have for them?
Yes, I'd like to know their name. What is your name, sir, or madam, whoever it is?
So you don't have a question for them. You just
would like
their name?
Please.
It was our Director of Policy, Rick Tice, a very long-time, hard-working political staffer in this town.
Rick Tice, okay. And was that the only conversation the PMO had with the WE charity or its associated groups?
No, as I previously stated, there were a handful in
How many?
In total. Well, a handful usually suggests around 5. I don't have an exact number. There were a few interactions around the time
staff members did that?
Launch of the announcement.
Which staff member?
Give Ms. Telford time to answer Mr. Polyev. Ms. Telford.
There was some back and forth that is perfectly normal and actually expected around the time of the launch of the program.
Okay, so we'll get we want their names, and we expect that you will submit their names. Will you give us the names? Yes or no?
I can get back to you.
Yes or no? Will you give?
I can look into that.
Okay, so you're obviously trying to cover up who they are and their identities.
No,
so we're
I'm
onto
trying
something
to
here.
answer whatever questions you might have for them.
I have a question right now. Is there anything that might have happened in the conversation with Rick and we that would have alerted we that they could begin implementing the program on May 5th?
Ms. Telford.
Yes or no?
No, I don't believe so. And actually, as I already stated, he actually redirected the organization, which he had a very general discussion with them on, and he redirected them to ESDC.
Okay, that's interesting because they claim that the ESDC is, we're told, is the one that then told them they could start working on May 5th. Very strange, because the Prime Minister claimed that the decision was not made in Cabinet until May the 22nd. So if the PMO was not directing the work to begin, then who told we that they could start working on a project that didn't exist, would not go on to exist for at least another 12 or 13 days?
Ms. Telford, you have about half a minute.
So as one of your colleagues already asked me about this, and I will repeat my answer, which is that the program only launched at the end of June, and in terms of the details of how the program was constructed in the...
Mr. Polyev, give the witness time without interruption, and we give her equal time. Go ahead, Ms. Telford.
The program was announced at the end of June, and in terms of the details around the contribution agreement, I would refer you back to, and I know you've already spoken to them, officials from the department who were involved in that.
Right. So your office spoke to we on May the 5th. And May the 5th is the day that we believed it could start spending money and implementing the program. Is that just a coincidence?
Ms. Telford.
This policy staff person in our office did what they do all the time,
yes or
which
no?
is take phone calls from stakeholders. He took a phone call from a stakeholder and redirected it
yes
to
or no?
ESDC.
It wasn't a stakeholder. It was a group that was implementing a taxpayer-funded program on behalf of your government, one that hadn't even been approved by cabinet. So I asked you if it was a mere coincidence that we began implementing this program on the day that the group spoke to Rick in your office, and you refused to answer that question.
Ms. Telford, you will have about 30 seconds to answer this, and then you're going to have to split 30 seconds between the two of you. The floor is yours, Ms. Telford.
I can't speak to how the contribution agreement constructed the details around how they looked back at that time period, because I do believe it was that. In terms of the conversation involving my office, it was a general discussion that was then redirected to ESDC. It actually was as simple as that.
Well, it sounds like the PMO directed the ESDC to give go-ahead for the program to begin on that very day before cabinet
That is not true.
Cabinet even
That
approved.
is not true.
Before cabinet even approved the decision. This is the timeline you're expecting us to believe, that the Prime Minister would not approve this in cabinet until May the 22nd. Even though a month earlier, the department had told the charity that it had the go-ahead, that it would receive the program. And 2 weeks earlier, before that cabinet decision, they would begin working on it. That timeline is not just hard to believe, it is chronologically impossible.
Mr. Polyev, that'll end your round. I will give Ms. Telford ample time to reply in detail if she likes.
I would just add that on May 5th, to add to the things that happened on May 5th, that was the day that this proposal went to the COVID Cabinet Committee. And so it's possible officials were in touch with them in and around that. But I can't speak to that. What I can speak to is what I know, which is it went to Cabinet Committee that day. It then came to Cabinet or it was going to go to Cabinet on May 8th. And it was then that we were first briefed on that.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you both. We'll go to Mr. McLeod. And who is up next from the official opposition? You can give me a hand in a bit. Mr.
I'll be
McLeod.
out, Mr. Chair, in the next round.
Mr. Morantz, okay. Mr. McLeod, you have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation today and for joining us to answer the many, many questions. There is a lot of work that's been happening on this issue. As I mentioned to the Prime Minister, we've had now 5 meetings on this study. I think there's probably going to be 2 other committees if they're not already in place. Looking at this, reviewing it and studying it, and all this is happening in the middle of a pandemic. And after every session that we have, I always get a lot of calls and people asking me about certain concerns they heard or certain issues that they don't understand or to explain things. So you mentioned a couple of times now the COVID committee. Could you just maybe elaborate a little bit on what they do and what their responsibilities are? My first question.
Yes. So I believe it would have been, I'm not entirely certain of the date, but I believe it would have been in early March. Might have been as early as late February, but I believe it was early March that the Prime Minister struck a cabinet committee, which we refer to as the COVID Cabinet Committee, and that Deputy Prime Minister Freeland chairs, and the Treasury Board Chair Jean-Yves Duclos vice chairs. And it has been a place to be able to move and take proposals that are involving the emergency measures and the restart. It's been as we've all said, it's an incredible time. It's an unprecedented time. Things are moving extremely quickly. They've been meeting multiple times a week for months now, and for many hours a day at a time. And they look at all of these emergency measures and apply a lens that the cabinet committees pre-COVID would as well in other areas. Of course, there were cabinet committees on reconciliation and on the economy and on global security. So, we kind of consolidated things to deal with the emergency measures and restart to do with COVID to the COVID committee. And things would go to the COVID committee before then coming to a cabinet meeting, which have also been happening more frequently than even before COVID.
It sounds like they're a very busy committee. Could you maybe give us an idea of how many other programs that have gone through the COVID committee and or cabinet during this time period that this committee was formed? I know there's so many things on the go right now.
I am not sure of how many exactly. So I don't want to guess at that, but it has been, there have been, as I mentioned, between the Canada Emergency Wage Benefit, the CERB, the programs for seniors, for vaccine development, for the manufacturing sector and biomanufacturing. It has been an endless number of programs, and that's going to keep going for quite some time. They're doing, as you say, they're doing a lot of work.
Through all these programs that are you mentioned, and there's more that you didn't mention, but is the advice of the public service taken on the implementation of all these different programs? Is there an mechanism for input from public service?
Absolutely. Everything that comes as a memorandum to cabinet is something that is crafted by the public service.
So I want to ask one final question because it's very important to me. The opportunity to help the students through a summer volunteer program was brought to cabinet, and the decision was either to make it happen or not do anything about it. And I'm glad that cabinet decided to go forward. Unfortunately, it kind of went off the rails. Now, the need that was identified when initially the cabinet was considering this is still there. Is there opportunity to revisit this issue, maybe rejig the terms, maybe have a different agency deliver it, maybe change the time frame so that it goes into October even? Is there opportunity to do something like that, to kind of save what's left of the summer and maybe into the fall and help the students, because they still need the help?
They do. And fortunately, this was one of many programs that have been put in place to help young people. And, as I mentioned earlier, this was, which is not to diminish it at all, but it was, less than 1/10 of the package that was announced even just for the COVID period. And as some of your colleagues on the committee had previously mentioned, there's the longstanding Canada Summer Jobs Program and other programs also in place to help youth. Having said that, in terms of this program specifically, I know that the Minister of Diversity, Inclusion and Youth is looking at all the options, and I hope that something, as you're suggesting, can be figured out.
Okay, with that, we are a little over time. We'll go to Mr. Morantz, followed by Mr. Fragiskatis. Marty, floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Telford, I want to return to the question of the timeline that my colleague was asking you about, Mr. Poilievre. On April 22nd, the Prime Minister from his front steps announced this program, the Canada Student Service Grant. You testified you didn't learn about it until May 8th, and that, in fact, you didn't know WE was being considered until May 8th. In fact, you say the PMO policy people didn't speak to WE until May 5th. When the Prime Minister announced this program on April 22nd, what did the PMO think? How did they think this program was going to be administered?
Excuse me. So just to clarify for you, on April 22nd, when he announced the $9 billion aid package for students and to support students through this time, you're right, he did announce as part of that the Canada Summer Student Grant, but there was
no plan for having it administered, though. There was no.
There were a lot of things during this period. It was important for us to be transparent with Canadians on what was coming. It was important for us to let students know that this kind of program was coming.
But you said yourself it was, or the Prime Minister did, that it was a binary choice. How can he announce a program that he doesn't know is going to be administered? How it's going to be done?
Mr. Morantz, it took you.
I'm just asking a fair question, Mr.
I know you took about 50 seconds to ask the question. I will give Ms. Telford, without interruption, the same amount of time to answer.
Though, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Ms. Telford.
So at the time, and I believe the Prime Minister spoke to this in his when he appeared before committee earlier, he actually believed that the option in terms of administering the program might be the Canada Service Corps. That he'd long been looking at and working on, and was actually, I think a bit disappointed much later when he learned that the only way it could be done was to go to a third-party organization for the purposes of this summer.
So in other words, the Prime Minister announced a program, a $9 billion program, part of which is the Canada Summer Student Benefit, and really had nothing nailed down as to how it would be delivered. And in fact, on May 8th, it was advised it was a binary choice. It was we or nothing, and it ended up being nothing. It just stretches credulity. Let me ask you, in your long tenure in politics and as the Chief of Staff, have you ever had this situation before where a program got announced and you had no idea, the office you're responsible for, how it's going to be administered?
There's a lot of things that have happened in the last number of months that I don't think any of us any of you on the committee or any of us in government have experienced before. And actually, something that I think has been really, really important that this government has been doing is letting Canadians know what's coming, what we're working on, and being extremely transparent, including saying it's not all going to be perfect and we're going to need to adjust as we go.
Yeah, but this is different. This is announcing a $1 billion program without knowing how it's going to be administered. How can Canadians have any faith that you are respecting their taxpayers' dollars when you announce a program? The Prime Minister announces a program. He has no idea how it will be administered. Anyway,
would you like me to answer that?
Yeah. Well, I don't. Sure, go ahead.
Yes, please do, Ms. Telford. The floor is yours.
I think Canadians can have faith in how this government is delivering, because of what the supports that they're feeling, the fact that this government is being responsive, the fact that when the CERB and the wage subsidy weren't as simple and generous as maybe it needed to be, we made sure to make those adjustments. And you know what? Yes, for students as well. There was a $9 billion package announced for students. The majority, the large majority of which is still supporting.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Please, yes, Mr. Fraser.
You've made very clear on a number of occasions that the rules for this committee are under the same COVID rules that the Parliament has been using. I shouldn't say Parliament, that the COVID committee has been using, where the questioner and the answer have equal time to give their answers and questions without interruption. I would ask that my honourable colleagues show just a modicum of respect to our witness and give her the time to answer the question, because quite frankly, as a parliamentarian who's trying to pay attention to what's going on, I cannot hear the answer that is coming out, and I would ask that you enforce the rules that you make clear were in application at the beginning of this meeting. Thank you.
I thank you.
I will, Mr. Chair, and I apologize, but please, I ask that you not take my time away for that.
We won't take the time away from you, Mr. Morantz, but I will give Ms. Telford time to respond. Go ahead. Ms. Telford?
I believe that actually, an adjustment that has happened that we haven't seen by any governments in the past during COVID that has been hugely beneficial to the relationship between a government and Canadians is just how transparent and forthcoming the government is in saying, here's what might be coming, here's what we're looking at, here's how we're going to adjust, here's when it's not right exactly. I actually believe there are many, many reasons, but especially in starting with the programs that got out the door so quickly, thanks to the very, very hard work of the public service in the early weeks of the COVID shutdown.
Okay, we will go back to Mr. Morantz, and this will be the last question.
Well, I still have not heard an answer to the question, how the Prime Minister announces this program without having any idea how it's going to be administered. That wasn't an answer, frankly, Mr. Chair. And maybe there isn't. Maybe they don't have one because they knew. It seems to stretch credulity that the Prime Minister did not know when he announced how it was being administered. Did he know or not? How's that? Did he know or not?
And Ms. Telford, do you have about 30 seconds to answer?
The Prime Minister announced a $9 billion package to support students, and that particular element of that package was still to be determined. And he had a number of ideas at the time of how it might be administered. But in moving on to work on a number of other emergency measures, while others worked it up, it then came back to him later that the only way to do this was with this binary choice that we've described to you.
Okay, thank you. That's it, Marty. Sorry for that.
Thank you.
We'll go to Mr. Fragiskatis, and then it will be Mr. Fortin for 2.5 minutes, Mr. Julian. And if it's okay with the committee, I would allow Ms. May in for 2. And on to an official opposition, and we'll probably wrap up with Mr. Sabara. Mr. Fragiskatis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Telford, thank you for being here and for the work that you've done these past few months. First of all, Mr. Chair, it would have been good if Mr. Poilievre had read the blues from the meeting that we had the other day. I have those blues in front of me. He was trying to connect dots that frankly do not exist. Let me quote from those blues. Ms. Darowitz asked the question to Mark Kielburger, and I'll quote her as follows. There is another thing that I'm a bit unclear about. I see the contribution in front of me. That's the contribution agreement, Mr. Chair. And it was signed on May 5th. Was it signed on May 5th, or did the agreement begin on May 5th? If you could just explain the logistics around all of that. Mark Kielburger replied with the following. Thank you for asking. The agreement technically began on May 5th. We were working in advance with ESDC on putting resources to help develop the program. The turnaround time was so tight, and we were, of course, so passionate about helping young people at this time that we got to work right away with a full risk and understanding that if this agreement did not go forward, we would be at the financial risk of doing so. We accepted that risk because we really wanted to help. So that's directly from the blues, Mr. Chair. Obviously, the organization made the decision on their own volition to proceed on May 5th. I wanted to clear that up because, as I said, Mr. Poilievre is trying to weave things out of thin air, as he often does. But leave that aside. I actually do want to go back to that meeting, if I could, Ms. Telford. I'm talking about the meeting where the Kielburgers both came. And I'll quote from that meeting as well. They said in their introductory remarks, I believe it was Craig Kielburger, and I'll quote him here now. As per the contribution agreement, We Charity would only be reimbursed its costs to build and administer the program, he said. To be clear, there was no financial benefit for the charity. We Charity would not have received any financial gain from the CSSG program, the Canada Student Service Grant Program, of course, and it is incorrect to say otherwise. Ms. Telford, does that correspond with your understanding?
I apologize, Mr. Chair. Something has just come up on my screen. I just need someone to come and. Sorry, there's a big.
We can see you, Ms. Telford, and we can hear you. Okay. And Mr. Fragiskatis, you're coming across kind of gravelly. Can you adjust your mic somewhat? Did you hear what Mr. Fragiskatis said, Ms. Telford?
Sorry, I didn't catch the last part. I had big exclamation marks flashing at me.
Okay. Then if you could repeat the last part.
Yeah, it could be the connection. I'm sorry about that. I was quoting from Craig Kielberger, who came and testified a few days ago. I did say, I'll just repeat the statement just because I'm not sure what part you heard and what part you didn't. So he said, as per the contribution agreement, We Charity would only be reimbursed its costs to build and administer the program. To be clear, there was no financial benefit for the charity. We Charity would not have received any financial gain from the Canada Student Service Grant Program, and it is incorrect to say otherwise. My question to you, Ms. Telford, was whether or not that explanation matches with your understanding.
I believe it does, yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. I also had a question relating to WE's network, their network of being in touch with 2.5 million students, 7,000 schools. When the public service advised that we would be the charity organization to move ahead with administering and building the Canada Student Service Grant, that was a key reason, right? That's our understanding as a committee. That has come up before. Can you speak to that at all?
Absolutely. I mean, this was an organization that, despite all the things that are being talked about now, this was an organization that was internationally renowned, that was nationally renowned. I can tell you that my 9-year-old son knows the name of this organization and not from me. It's, there's a school named after a Kielberger. It is, this is a very large organization in this country. And so it was not surprising in many ways to see it as being an organization that could do this. Having said that, it was still surprising to see it as a binary choice, and that is why we asked a lot of questions around it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, final quick question, Mr. Fragiskatis.
Sure, and the question or something along these lines has been asked already by Mr. McLeod. I took the opportunity earlier with the Prime Minister to raise it, and I've raised it before. Just simply on behalf of constituents, though, I have to ask again, for youth going forward, if the Canada Student Service Grant does not materialize, what can members of Parliament tell youth in their communities about supports that will continue to be made available? Obviously, there's the Canada Emergency Student Benefit that's being accessed by so many young people across the country. But in terms of further supports that can be there for students on the one hand, but also for not-for-profits.
Quickly, Mr. Fragiskatis.
Many in the community that are reeling right now, what is the message that you would put to them?
So look, I think there's a lot of other programs that are there to support students, and obviously there is more work to continue to do. And as I said, I know the Minister of Diversity, Inclusion and Youth is passionate about this and is working very hard along with her colleagues to look at more solutions and supports for students in terms of the nonprofit sector more broadly or specific to youth. And it's interesting because these are organizations where actually they were also used as third-party organizations, and contribution agreements were organized with these organizations like the Community Foundations of Canada, the Canadian Red Cross, the United Way, and Centraide Canada. There's a lot of different. Minister Hussein has been actively engaged and announced a number of supports for nonprofits and the charitable sector as well.
Okay, we will have to move on to Mr. See if you can get the technology people to look at that mic sound there, Mr. Fragiskatis. Mr. Fortin, you're on.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Madame Telford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Telford, now as Chief of Staff, and the role of your team is to advise the Prime Minister. When we see that the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance tell us that they did not speak to the issue in May, when we hear today that they regret and apologize for not having recused themselves, you agree that they should not have. Are you happy then with the work done by your team on this file?
Look, as I said in the outset in my opening remarks, this obviously did not go the way it should have gone. And I do share in some responsibility for that. Of course I do. as the person who was giving advice to the Prime Minister. And but I do the best I can with the best information I can, and that's what I'm going to keep doing to help serve and support Canadians.
Vous avez eu combien de discussions?
How many discussions did you have with the Prime Minister between the 8th and the 22nd of May before the decision was made?
Je parle de discussions.
And I'm talking about discussions on that subject.
If it was more generally, I wouldn't be able to. I have no idea. It's been a lot during this period. Specifically on this subject during that period from May 8th to the following cabinet meeting that it went to 2 weeks. It was about 2 weeks later. We certainly had a briefing again ahead of the next cabinet meeting, and then there was another briefing. I believe just before that as well, where we took a longer period of time to go through the details.
Qui participait à ces briefings-là?
Who participated in those briefings?
It's pretty usual. It's the senior officials within the Privy Council office, as well as senior staff within the Prime Minister's office.
Et tous ces gens-là.
And none of those people were able to prevent the Prime Minister from recusing himself for the granting of a contract on May 22nd. No one succeeded in convincing him to recuse himself.
As I've already stated, we spent our time trying to ensure that due diligence was done on this, that this was the right thing to do to support students at that time. And we knew the facts as we knew them at the time in terms of the Prime Minister's having spoken at some events, and in terms of Sophie Gregoire-Trudeau's connection to the We organization, and we knew that had been cleared, and so there wasn't a discussion on conflict at that time.
And the Minister of Finance had traveled at the expense of We Charity. You knew that as well?
No, we did not know that or discuss that at that time.
Okay, thank you both. Mr. Julian, floor is yours, and we'll be followed by, if it's okay with the committee, Ms. May. Mr. Julian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Prime Minister's testimony seems to be collapsing like a house of cards. First, he said he didn't know anything, and he said, well, we did all our due diligence, but to date, we've not had a single indication of what due diligence was done. These positions were advertised as volunteer jobs, and yet that, of course, would violate both minimum wage laws across the country and labor standards legislation. To what extent was due diligence done on this project, on this scheme, to actually assure that it was in conformity and legal according to minimum wage laws and to labor standards across the country?
Ms. Telford?
Look, a memorandum does not go to cabinet without due diligence being done, and it was then held up so that extra layers of due diligence were done to ensure that everyone felt comfortable recommending it to cabinet a second time. And as I've already said, this didn't go the way it should have gone. And there are additional layers and layers of scrutiny or questions, knowing what we know now, that would have been good to ask at the time, but we didn't. We only knew what we knew then.
Has the RCMP contacted the PMO, any officials in the Prime Minister's office so far since the scandal broke?
No.
OK. Je vais passer en anglais, en français maintenant.
I'll now switch to French. Now, this is the third time this has happened. The Prime Minister said after the first controversy, if I had to redo it, I would have done things differently. I would have talked with the Commissioner's office from the outset to have approval for everything that we did. So, indeed, none of that occurred. So here's my question. Why? When supposedly the Prime Minister, he apparently supposedly should have learned from the previous scandals. Why, on this third occasion, is it so clear that none of the procedures weren't followed?
We talk to the Ethics Commissioner's office all the time, or I wouldn't be able to tell you that we received clearance from the Ethics Commissioner's office for the work that Sophie Gregoire-Trudeau was doing with the We organization. And so what I can tell you is that it is an office that everybody in our office respects, that we take very seriously, and that we go back and forth with them on a very frequent basis.
Mr. Julian? Are we having trouble?
Non, merci, Monsieur Président.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, but the question is simple. Who's responsible in the Prime Minister's office for ensuring that that laws are followed, are respected? Who's responsible for that? Is it you? Who is responsible for this violation of ethics legislation?
Ms. Telford, and that'll be the end of that round, Mr. Julian. Ms. Telford.
So I will repeat what I stated before, which is that the Prime Minister has never received any payment, any income of any kind from the WE organization, both before and since becoming Prime Minister. And that was something we were clear on, that we had gone to the Ethics Commissioner in terms of the potential involvement. We went before there was any involvement. We got it signed off ahead of time in terms of Sophie's involvement, in terms of podcast, in terms of potential travel, in terms of potential expenses. And so we take those steps very seriously.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any objection to allowing Ms. May in for a couple of minutes? And who do I go to in the official opposition after her, if she's allowed to question?
Barrett.
I see you, Mr. Polyev.
Barrett will go with that one.
Okay.
Michael Barrett.
Okay, thank you. Miss May, a couple of minutes. You've been at every meeting. Go ahead.
Thank you, colleagues. I just want to say for Canadians who may find it hard to believe that civil servants and cabinet ministers and everybody, including a bunch of us on the screen, work 20-hour days, 7 days a week at the beginning of the pandemic. We all witnessed it. And I don't want to let that remark that you made, Ms. Telford, go forward without corroboration. You guys all worked, you were killing yourselves in this period. But that doesn't mean that we can't investigate. I find it hard to believe that the Prime Minister was, and I'm not doubting that he did actually, I just want to know, he seems very convinced that he thought Canada Service Corps was going to deliver this program up till May 8th. He'd announced it on April 22nd. From the testimony of civil servants, including Rachel Warnick, we knew that they were considering WE before the announcement, at least a week before the announcement, and that on May 5th, as we know, Minister Chager took it to the COVID committee, clearly putting the WE charity as the agency to deliver this. Can you explain how it's possible? Did no one want to tell the Prime Minister, burst his bubble, tell him his favorite Operation Canada Service Corps was just not going to be able to do it? Why did no one tell him before May 8th that Canada Service Corps was out of it and WE charity was delivering the program?
Ms. Telford.
I think, to be fair, that was a question he actually had on May 8th as well, which is why it was pulled back so that he could get a better understanding of things. And it partly speaks to the speed and the volume of work during that period, as well as other events during that period that I know I don't need to remind anyone about. It has been an incredible time, above and beyond the pandemic in terms of what this country has been having to go through. And I guess one thing maybe to help clarify that would be on, I believe it was April 20th. It was in the package that I was referencing earlier. It was the very large package that came ahead of that announcement that had the 9 annexes to it. On Annex 4, page 5, it actually talks about the Canada Summer Student Grant. And in it, it talked about the need or the potential need at that point, because that was all that was written into it at that time, the potential need for a third party to be able to make this work. And it did talk about it gave some examples of delivery agent, administrator, that kind of thing. We was one of the examples in there at that time. But it was an example of a potential method of doing it. So that was as far as it had come to us. So we knew people were working on these things. The Canada Service Corps was still something in his mind and that was still in the mix. And we didn't actually see the return on their further work on that until we saw it on May 8th.
Okay, I will have to end it there. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thanks. Sorry, but we'll go to Mr. Barrett, who will be followed back into 5-minute rounds. Mr. Barrett will be followed by Mr. Sabera.
Ma'am, you said a handful of people spoke to we before the agreement was announced. You've given one name. Who are the other four?
I already said there was some communication staff around the time of what was a big announcement and a launch. So it's perfectly normal for communication staff to go back and forth.
What
with
were their
those
names,
involved.
ma'am?
I said I would look into that for you.
So you commit today to provide those names to the committee and the dates on which they communicated with the we organization?
I will look into it. I can consult with folks.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Polyev.
This is information the committee is entitled to receive. The witness knows the names. If she didn't, she wouldn't be able to enumerate how many there were. She is obliged to answer the question, and I ask that you require that answer right now. The names of PMO staffers who spoke with we. No need for a cover-up.
I believe Ms. Telford is agreeing to provide us with the names when she looks at her records.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
That's not what we've been told.
Okay, then I'll ask for clarification from Ms. Telford. Can she provide us the committee the names after she looks at her records?
It's just to be clear, Mr. Chair, it's not my records. I will need to go and consult with the individuals involved, and I would really ask the members that I am here on the staff's behalf and happy to take any questions that they have for them.
I think the question was a little more than that. I'll go to Mr. Barrett while we think about this for a moment. Mr. Barrett.
Well, ma'am, you're required to disclose this information. It's necessary for us to know. This is why we have things like a lobbyist registry. We need to know who has contacted whom and on what dates. This is germane to this study. It's germane to the committee's work. And I'm going to ask you again to commit that you will provide the names and the dates of the communication.
I would as well point out, Ms. Telford, I believe the clerk of the Privy, there is a request from the committee for documents that was carried, and the clerk of the Privy Council had committed to get those documents. I'm not sure if these are in them or not, but I believe that is where we're at. Ms. Telford.
So just to be clear, I didn't enumerate, as was alleged earlier, that the exact number of staff. I said there was
a handful, and usually that means 5.
Yes. Sorry?
Go ahead, Ms. Telford, before you're interrupted.
So yes, in and around that number, and there was only the one prior to around the time of the launch. Around the time of the launch, there was some back and forth usual media relations kinds of check-ins.
Do you know the names of any other individuals who are in the room?
I would want to check before I give them to committee.
Okay, Mr. Barrett.
So how are we only learning today that the Prime Minister came and pulled the agreement from Cabinet on May 8th? We've had testimony from the Clerk of the Privy Council, from multiple ministers, including Minister Chagger, Minister Morneau, and the Prime Minister up until today has not said that. How is it that you've just saved this amazing story for today?
When you say the Prime Minister just said that, well, the Prime Minister was only just a witness at your committee, and he was happy to provide this information, as am I. I believe also that the Clerk of the Privy Council did make reference to the questions I was asking around this and the due diligence around this that we were pushing on.
Yes, he did, Mr. Barrett.
He did not say that the Prime Minister pulled it. Correct?
No, I believe what he said was due diligence. Ms. Telford.
I'm not certain what the clerk said to the committee, other than I do know that he made reference to the due diligence that we had asked for.
In your office, are people typically held responsible for errors? Like who in government do you think has been held responsible for the errors that led to where we are today?
Look, as I've already said, this obviously didn't roll out in the way that we would have liked. And there's a number of us, including myself, who share in that responsibility.
If this committee ordered all communications, emails, and texts between PMO and we, would you comply with that order? Like this was a commitment made by your government when you came to office that the PMO would release this type of information freely. Will you hide behind cabinet confidences and the Access to Information Act, or will you disclose this information?
Mr. Barrett, I would have to seek advice on what I can and can't when it comes to cabinet confidences.
Mr. Barrett, last question.
I should have about a minute and a half left, Mr. Chair. There were substantial interruptions and clarifications there, but iwantohelp.org is the name of a website to apply for the CSSG. So did the government create this website, or was it created by we? And the reason I ask, ma'am, is on the April 22nd announcement, it mentions the I Want to Help platform twice, which is the origin of I Want to Help. So what I'm looking for is the origin of the I Want to Help branding, because in that April 22nd announcement, it includes branding from the company we.
Ms. Telford, and you will have one more question. You are correct. There was interruptions. Ms. Telford, if you'd answer that, and we'll go to one more question from Mr. Barrett.
Sorry, I don't know the answer to that.
Well, in fairness, ma'am, I'd ask that you commit to undertaking to provide that answer to the committee. And I guess my last question would be that between those dates that you mentioned before and were referenced by one of the other members, what between May 8th and May 24th, what allowed you and the Prime Minister to take this project from yellow to green?
Having the opportunity to have a longer conversation with senior officials and senior staff around why it did come back the way that it did. As per one of your colleagues in the committee's question earlier, there had been different thoughts around what this might look like when it was first discussed. And so we wanted to have a better understanding of that. We also wanted to have an understanding that all the T's have been crossed and the I's have been dotted, as you know, as the clerk said. That's why we were asking questions around due diligence and making sure that it was the right method to do this. So not only was it the right organization, but that entering into this contribution agreement was the right way to do it, and we were assured that it was.
Thank you both. Mr. Sabero, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the committee members for asking all these insightful questions today. Ms. Telford, thank you. Nice to see you this afternoon. First question: what process is in place in the office, in your office, in relation to consulting on issues of ethics?
So when staff start here, and oftentimes before they start in these roles, it was certainly the case in my situation, and I know in others, we sit down with either the ethics commissioner themselves, as was the case for me in 2015, or with one of the officers in the ethics commissioner's office to go through what all of the different considerations are in starting these positions. There's a number of other documents. We have a head of HR, and they make sure that there's a number of other documents that are reviewed by staff, and when they're starting, so that they're onboarded appropriately. And we encourage all staff all the time to take all ethical matters extremely seriously. We are in privileged seats serving Canadians here, and not only now, but at any time. We're all very privileged to be and honored to be in the roles that we're in serving Canadians. And so we take that very seriously, and we encourage everyone, when they've got a question, to check, to ask, to go to the ethics commissioner, to talk to one of the senior staff about it, and we can help them if we know any history on it. But ultimately, it's always, that we try to go to the ethics commissioner when we can to get clarification, or to go to the Privy Council office. But most importantly, it is ensuring that everyone is onboarded properly, and that we follow all of the different interpretations and advice that comes from the ethics commissioner's office. And when we're not sure, we check.
Okay.
Mr. Sabero.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you, Ms. Telford, for that very clear answer. In terms of due diligence, because the word due diligence has come up quite a bit, and our government has put in place a number of programs that are helping Canadians from coast to coast to coast. And if we see, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, which is being delivered through the Canada Revenue Agency, or we see the Canada Emergency Business Account, which is being delivered through our financial institutions, everything from small credit unions to the big banks. And then we see programs like the Emergency Community Support Fund, which is being delivered through the United Way and various partner agencies. So obviously there is a level of due diligence that is done by government and by governmental officials that is higher. You're dealing with the CRA, an agency that's well known to the government, part of the government, but then you're dealing with the United Way or or organizations in this place, volunteer organizations, where we receive recommendations from government officials, public servants who've done a phenomenal job for Canadians from coast to coast to coast. But the due diligence on our part is higher because we are dealing with third parties. We're not dealing directly with governmental organizations. So I'd like to understand that process and just looking at the due diligence when it refers to third party organizations and how important it was for the Prime Minister, for yourself, for others around Cabinet to ask those tougher questions with the information that's being presented to you when we're looking at third party organizations.
Well, I think you just touched on exactly, why we paused. And as someone else described it, went from yellow to green, or perhaps went from green to yellow. It had already gone from the Cabinet Committee and was heading toward Cabinet for ratification when we actually turned it to yellow. And part of the reason was because for the reasons you said, it was a third party organization. And we wanted to make sure that everybody was perfectly comfortable with it, that the public service truly was recommending it as the way to go. And they stood by that recommendation over the coming 2 weeks. But I think it's all the reasons that you're saying that it's really important. And, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of reviewing done in the coming weeks and months to make sure that, that as much due diligence as necessary is always done on these third-party organizations. But at the time, the assurances were given that this was the right organization to proceed with.
Yeah.
Last question, Mr. Severa.
No, and in terms of moving forward, and I think about the number of youth across Canada that had signed up for this program and how important it was for them to sign up. And I see, and I've read from some of the statistics that over 50% came from communities, marginalized communities, called racialized communities, whichever term that you would prefer. And it is disappointing to now know that we had to hit the pause button on this program. Other programs are running in place, and I'm glad that we have expanded we did expand the Canada Summer Jobs, offering youth extra $60 million into that program. But I do hope that going forward that we can restart a similar type of program where youth are invited to apply, get that volunteer experience, because we know how valuable and enriching that volunteer experience is for them.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Telford.
Well, I hope the same. And I know there are people that are working very, very hard on it. It is really important. As I said, there were kind of two jobs as we saw it when we talked about youth and young people and students back on April 5th, which feels a lot longer ago now than the date implies. But when we talked at that time, job one was making sure that we got students, which we did to the best of our ability, get students the support they needed to be able to pay rent, to be able to put groceries on the table. And then number two is finding ways through existing programs, as well as potentially through some new programs, which this was hoping to be able to allow young people to stay connected to their communities, to even have an experience that they might not otherwise have during this pandemic.
Okay, Ms. Telford, we will thank you for your testimony. We have now reached the 2 hours that we asked you to come, and you accepted. We're a little over it, actually. So we'll thank you for your testimony today. And I would also, before we close off, certainly like to thank the translators, Library of Parliament folks who have worked so due diligently this week in order to make all these meetings that we've had possible. So with that, Ms. Telford, you're free to go. Are we ready to close the meeting?
Point of order, Point of order, Mr. Chair. I'd like to make a motion that the committee ask the Prime Minister's office to release the names of all of the staff members that spoke to the We organization, to the Kielburger brothers, to any affiliates of the We organization after March the 1st.
Okay, the motion is, I believe, in order, Madam Clerk. I believe it's in order. I see, go ahead.
To repeat it so that I can have it for the record.
Okay, could you repeat it fairly slowly, Mr. Polyev?
That the Prime Minister's office release to the committee by the end of the next calendar week the names of all Prime Minister's office staff members who communicated with the We Charity, the Kielburger brothers, any affiliates of the We Charity since March the 1st, and that the PMO provide the dates and participants, and contents of those meetings.
Okay, the motion is on the floor. You have got that, I assume, Madam Clerk. And do you want to speak to it further, Mr. Polyev, or will I go to Mr. Julian?
Well, I'll speak very briefly. I think there should be no controversy about this issue. The chief of staff was asked repeatedly. She said as to whether or not there were PMO staffers who spoke to the We organization in the period in question, and she said yes, there was. Yes, there were. Excuse me. There was a handful of staff members in the Prime Minister's office. A handful she later defined to be 5, who spoke to the Kielburgers during the period in question. But then she said she would not release their names, and she did not release a chronology of the dates of their conversations, nor did she release the content of their conversations. So obviously we need to know this, because the entire government's entire case is that this whole strange program was dreamt up by the public service with no involvement or influence by the political arm of the government or the staff of the Prime Minister. But if these conversations occurred, then that might contradict it. Finally, the Lobbying Act requires that all of these interactions be registered, and we have no registry of any such conversations. So we need to find out if the Lobbying Act was violated in the course of these conversations. Thank you.
Okay, just Mr. Julian, and go ahead, Mr. Julian. I'm just thinking out loud. I was wondering if these are already included in the Clerk of the Privy Council's correspondence. But go ahead, Mr. Julian. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be supporting the motion, but I'm offering a friendly amendment to Mr. Polyev. So he has disappeared. Hopefully he will come back on in just a moment. That we include the cabinet memos with the recommendations on We for the May 8th and May 22nd cabinet meetings.
Is that a friendly amendment, Mr. Polyev? You're muted. I love that, but you go ahead.
All right. Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. It is a friendly amendment.
Okay. Then, Madam Clerk, I expect you got that as amended. I see Mr. Francesco, Mr. Sabera's hand up, and who else was yelling? Anybody else want in?
Before we move on, sir, can I just make sure that that's in addition to the end of the motion? Correct? Okay. And can I just get it right, including the cabinet memos for May 8th and May 22nd?
Concerning the We recommendations.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have Mr. Sabaro, and if there's anybody else, let me know. Okay, and Ms. Zerowitz, Mr. Sabaro.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as we sit here, and I believe it's the fourth or fifth hour of consecutively on the second day, and this afternoon, obviously, we had testimony from the Prime Minister of Canada, who came for 90 minutes to committee and answered many questions, and I thought clarified many issues, and that I wanted to hear about. And we also now had the Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister come to committee for 2 hours, answer many questions, provide clarity to many of the issues that have been raised and asked, and the questions asked. It just seems to me that with this motion that's being put forward by MP Polyev and with an amendment by the NDP, it's if I can call it scraping at the bottom of the barrel, going after like a witch hunt for junior staff members and so forth. You had today the Prime Minister and the Chief of Staff here at committee answering questions, and it seems like this is a more of, if I can call it, desperation, scraping at the barrel again. And that's my view of it. Plain and simple. We've heard testimony over the last several weeks, extensive testimony about the program, about how the program came about, the recommendation that was provided for a third party, that it went to cabinet, that further questions were asked, and this to me is an unnecessary scraping at the bottom of the barrel by the opposition. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, I have Ms. Zerowitz, and is there anybody beyond that before I go to the question? Ms. Zerowitz, you're on, and then we'll see if anybody raises their hand.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Literally, I think Mr. Sabaro was reading my brain. I was going to say the exact same words. This is a desperate attempt after we've completed very thoroughly investigating what the original motion, the intention of the original motion, proving that there's been no misspending of any money, proving that it's been responsibly signed, responsibly negotiated, responsibly selected, that there's been no interference by the Prime Minister, by any cabinet minister. It's been suggested by the civil servants. They have done an excellent job, a responsible job. And it's unfortunate that we have the ending right now, but it seems like that in the desperate attempt of the Conservatives to keep this alive somehow in the media, somehow they need to continue to keep the media, that they're scraping the bottom of the barrel. I will also point out that there was a motion put forward by Mr. Julian on Thursday, July the 2nd. We discussed it a few days later. That already includes all the relevant information around the decision for We Charity and Me to We, and the design and creation of the Canada Student Service Grant, the written correspondence, everything from March 2020 onward is going to be provided no later than August the 8th. I think all of that information will be provided. I think that will be able to validate everything that we have heard over the last couple of weeks and over five meetings. And so I just don't understand why there's a need for this motion today. So I will not be supporting it.
Okay. All right. Is there anyone else, or are we ready for the question? Mr. Fraser, then you will probably wrap it up.
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I might just add my voice to some of my colleagues. There's 2 points in particular that I find rub me the wrong way when it comes to the proposed motion. I think chiefly my concern is about the precedent it would set to start bringing more junior staff within political offices than those we've already heard testify. The Prime Minister of Canada and his Chief of Staff were here during this meeting. I've seen what happened when we had civil servants who were brought before this committee and badgered in a manner that I think is the kind of thing that will cause civil servants to more broadly be careful about giving open and honest feedback to governments. I don't appreciate the practice that this committee has implemented in their treatment of certain witnesses. I think we will potentially go down the same path should we continue to pull more junior and junior staff as witnesses in this testimony. Second, the point that I also want to raise is the fact that we don't actually have any evidence that there's been an effort by anyone at a political level to influence the workings of the civil service. If I had heard evidence to that testimony, I would think otherwise. Starting to request documents that are subject to cabinet confidence when there's no evidence whatsoever that they will suggest what the opposition has been hinting they might suggest, I don't think is a useful exercise for the purpose of this committee. For that reason, I won't be supporting the motion. Thank you very much.
Okay, then maybe Mr. Julian is going to wrap it up. Mr. Julian, I seen your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I mean, throughout the last 3 weeks, it's true, I sponsored the original motion. We've been hit by revelation after revelation, things that were told to us that were supposedly facts that turned out to be very, very different. And that's why this scandal has exploded. So for any member of this committee to say, well, we don't want to go any further because we may uncover other contradictions, other dishonesty within what we have been told originally and what Canadians have been told, I think would not be doing the due diligence that we as a committee need to undertake. We need to get that information. We need to get these answers for Canadians. It's very clear that as this has gone along, a massive amount of revelations have come in around the finance minister, around the prime minister's involvement, and around the complete lack of due diligence in this mess. So I can understand the Liberals putting on a partisan hat and saying, well, we don't want to get any further information, but we do have a responsibility, all of us, to get that information and to compare the facts so that we actually know what has actually occurred. And that's why I'm supporting the motion. I think we have to do that due diligence. It did not happen in the government. Our responsibility as parliamentarians is to perform that due diligence.
Okay, Madam Clerk, if we could go to a recorded vote, the list is in your hands.
I'm going to unmute myself here. Okay, so first, Ms. Zarowitz. No. Mr. Freshis-Katos.
No.
Mr. Fraser.
No.
Ms. Katrakis.
No.
Mr. McLeod.
No.
Mr. Poilievre.
Yes.
Mr. Cooper.
Yes.
Mr. Cumming.
Yes.
Mr. Morant.
Yes.
Mr. Fortin.
Oui.
Mr. Julian.
Yes.
The yeas have it.
Okay, then the motion is carried and that information will be passed forward. So we in a position to adjourn.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
I promise this will be my last one. I just wanted to thank you for your good work throughout this meeting. I know it was a tough meeting to chair, and you did a fine job. I was happy to help in my own small way where it was possible. And I want to let you know if there's ever a big storm again out in PEI, you can give me a call. I'd be glad to come out and help you through it again. Any blessings to you.
All right. Thank you for that. Yeah, it was a big storm. First time I got blacked out. Okay. With that, then I thank, again, I do want to thank the Library of Parliament people because I know they've been doing yeoman's work. Thank you, Madam Clerk, and all the other clerks who have helped us this week, the interpreters. And I do know we got a steering committee meeting tomorrow as well. But in any event, thank you one and all, and thank the members for their efforts this week. With that, meeting adjourned. Thank you all.
Short break. Coming back with the Jim Fannon Show. Here is a little something for you. I'm going to start the show out with this. 7 p.m. live Thursdays. We're right here. Trew.Tube. Trew.Tube. Twitch. Catching on your phone. iTunes. It's the Jim Fannon Show live. Ready? Here we go. 7 p.m. That's 3 minutes from now. We'll be back. Thanks for checking us out. Peace, love, and Mary Jane.